The bearded man with a pitchfork looked at him as if he were a corpse that had come back to life. And he was right. The body in which Dan had awakened had died of a fever 3 days ago. "Bread and the road," said the man. "And make sure your spirit's gone from here by noon." He tosses a piece of gray bread and slams the pigsty door shut. Dan picks up the bread, sniffs it, takes a bite. The teeth in this body are rotten, but the bread is real. He chews and remembers. The bridge. The night. 3 o'clock. The steering wheel of the 47 Dodge veers to the right. Water, darkness, and that's it. And now a pig stares at him without interest, and 2 moons hang through the holy roof. One big yellow one, the other small and blue. Dan spits. Fine, I'm dead. This isn't Oregon. This isn't even Earth. And I'm standing barefoot in manure. Fragments surface from somewhere deep within the very bones of this body. Dan Hopper, a farmhand, 23 years old, no relatives, no one will cry, no one will look for him. He stands up. His legs are shaky from his illness, but they hold him up. He steps out into the yard and freezes. A muddy road winds down toward a village of a dozen thatched roof houses. Beyond the village lies a forest. Beyond the forest, blue mountains. A foreign world. He wanders downhill and suddenly notices a piece of rusty iron in the mud. He bends down. He pulls it out. A fragment of a plowshare, heavy, rough, with bubbles and slag. But it's iron, real iron, and something clicks in his head. Not magic, not a flash of inspiration, just 20 years of manual labor coming together into a single thought. There's iron, there's wood, there's fire, there's water. There are definitely forges around here, since someone once forged this plowshare. And what isn't here? No bearings, no gears more complex than a mill wheel. No springs, no chain drives, no steam engines. Nothing like what Daniel Hopper from Portland had been assembling and taking apart for 20 years. He tucks the piece of metal into his coat and moves on. The village is called Crossstone. The old woman by the well flinches at him, but mutters that it's a 2-day walk south to the nearest town, Grimsholt, that the road is dangerous, that bandits wiped out a caravan a week ago, that there haven't been any horses in the village for a year because they were all taken off to war. And that's when Dan smirks. A world without horses. He heads south and does the math. There are smithies, so there's coal. If there's coal and water, then steam can be produced. If there's steam, then a piston is possible. If there's a piston, then an engine is possible. If there's an engine, then a machine is possible. And whoever builds a machine in a world without horses, that person will become the most important person on this earth. He coughs with his weak lungs and smirks again. For the first time in both his lives, he knows exactly what to do. That night he sleeps under a tree, wrapped in a sack he found by the road. He dreams of water, darkness, and the rumble of an engine. On the second day, he walks out to the wrecked caravan. 2 wagons are overturned. The crates are broken open. There's blood on the ground but no bodies. Dan examines the axles. They're broken. The hubs are worn down to the point of squeaking. No grease at all. He shakes his head. These wagons gave out long before the bandits did. He takes a leather strap and 2 iron rings. They'll come in handy. By evening, Grimsholt comes into view ahead. 100 houses behind a stone wall, a marketplace, a church with a tower, and smoke. Thick black smoke billows from 3 spots. Forges. Dan's heart races. Not out of fear, out of anticipation. He finds Master Horvick's forge at the southern end of town. The military forge is closed. The second one works only for the guild. That leaves old Horvick. He pays little, has a temper like a mule, but takes on apprentices. The yard looks as if time stood still here half a century ago. Soot-stained walls, a shed, an anvil, a bellows, a water barrel, and junk everywhere. Scraps of iron, old horseshoes, pieces of chains, rusty hinges, cracked cauldrons. Dan stands in the middle of this metal pigsty and smiles. It's paradise. Horvick comes out of the house. A sturdy old man in his 60s with hands like shovels. He sizes Dan up with his eyes. He asks what Dan needs. Dan says he's looking for work, that he knows how to work with metal, that all he needs is a roof over his head and food. Horvick snorts. He's seen 100 such handymen, and they all confused a hammer with a sledgehammer. But he needs a pair of hands to chop wood and haul coal. If you don't run off in 3 days, maybe you'll stick around. Dan is put up in the shed behind the blacksmith shop. In the evening, Horvik's wife, Grandma Ruth, comes by, a gaunt woman with sharp eyes. She sets porridge and bread in front of him. She stares at him for a long time. She says he's too skinny and that there'll be meat tomorrow. For 3 days, Dan chops wood, hauls coal, pumps the bellows, and says nothing. The old man watches him closely. On the 3rd day, Horvik forges a loop and strikes unevenly. The metal ripples. The old man curses and tosses the workpiece into a barrel. Dan says nothing. But as soon as Horvik turns away, Dan pulls the piece. The metal is still warm. He places it on the anvil and, with 3 precise blows, straightens out the wave. 3. No more. Horvik turns at the sound. He approaches. He looks at the loop, then at Dan. Silently, he takes it and goes back into the house. That evening, Ruth brings a double portion and a slice of pie. She says the old man asked about him, and that's a good sign. On the 5th day, Dan decides it's time. He asks Horvik to take a look at the broken mill mechanism. The old man grimaces. That piece of junk's been sitting here for half a year. The main gear is cracked. Ordering a new one from the capital costs 20 silver and takes 3 months to arrive. The mill's down, so the village has to buy flour from the neighbors at triple the price. Horvik tried to fix it himself and gave up. Go ahead, he says. It can't get any worse. Dan sits by the mechanism for half a day without touching a thing. He just looks. And he sees what Horvik doesn't see. Not the cracked gear. The system. The main gear transmits torque from the water wheel to the millstones. The gear ratio is 3-to-1. The crack runs along the line of maximum stress. It's pointless to repair it. It'll break in a month. But there are 2 smaller gears lying in the corner. The teeth are rough but intact. If he mounts them via an intermediate shaft and adds a belt drive, the millstone will turn about 15% slower. But it will turn. Dan works until dark. He removes the cracked gear. He forges a shaft from a piece of rebar. He fits the small gears. He installs a wooden pulley. He threads a leather belt from an old harness. He adjusts the clearances. He asks for water to be let onto the wheel. The water flows. The wheel turns. The gears mesh. The belt tightens. The millstone trembles and begins to turn. Slowly. With effort. But steadily. Horvik freezes in place. Dan pours in the grain. Flour spills out from under the millstone. Coarse, uneven, but flour nonetheless. By morning, the entire yard is packed with people. Half a year without flour. Half a year of triple the price from the neighbors. And now it's working. Horvik silently pours Dan a mug of beer. He sits down across from him. He looks him in the eyes, long and intently, and asks, "Kid, who are you anyway?" Dan takes a sip. He thinks for a second, and replies that he's just a mechanic. Horvik didn't press him for more details. The old blacksmith had lived for over 60 years and learned one simple thing. A man who can do more with his hands than he can say with his mouth deserves a roof over his head and a hot dinner. The rest will fall into place. The day after the mill was repaired, Horvik moved Dan from the barn to a small room next to the blacksmith shop. There was a bed, a table, and even a window. Grandma Ruth brought a clean blanket and set a clay jug of water on the table. She said breakfast was at 6, and if he was late, she'd feed his portion to the dog. Dan wasn't late even once. For the first week, he worked 12 hours a day in the blacksmith shop, not on his own projects, but for Horvik. He forged whatever the old man asked for: hinges, staples, horseshoes, plow points, nails, lots of nails. Horvik watched. He didn't praise him. Sometimes he corrected him, but with each passing day, he corrected him less and less. Dan was learning to work with the local iron. It was worse than what he was used to in his past life. Lots of slag, bubbles, uneven composition. One piece would be hard as a rock, and the next soft as butter. They didn't know proper heat treatment here. They hardened it by eye. They tempered it whenever they felt like it. Dan adapted. He was used to working with junk. In his workshop in Portland, half the parts for pre-war trucks were homemade. When you need a gear for a '46 Dodge Power Wagon and the last one sold at auction for $3,000, you learn to make gears yourself, out of whatever you have on hand. By the second week, Dan had started making small changes. He didn't ask Horvick for permission directly, but he didn't hide it either. He rearranged the tools on the wall in the order he used them. The ones he needed often were at the bottom, within arm's reach. The ones he rarely used were at the top. Horvick noticed on the third day and said nothing. Then Dan made a simple thing that changed the entire workflow of the shop. He assembled a foot-powered mechanism for the whetstone out of scraps of wood and a piece of leather. Before, Horvick had sharpened by hand, or asked an apprentice to turn the handle. Now the stone turned with the push of his foot, leaving both his hands free. Horvick stared at the contraption for about 5 minutes. Then he tried it out. Then he sat down on a bench and was silent for a long time. Then he said that in 40 years in the forge, he'd never once thought of something so simple. Dan said it wasn't a matter of intelligence but of habit. That back where he came from, everyone did it that way. Horvick asked where he came from. Dan said from far, very far away. Horvick nodded and didn't ask any more questions. By the end of the second week, Dan started thinking bigger. He'd made a temporary repair to the mill. The belt drive held, but the leather was wearing out quickly. He needed a proper chain drive, and for a chain drive, he needed links. And for the links, he needed a way to make identical small parts. And for that, he needed at least the simplest stamp. He started small. From a piece of good iron, he forged 2 mirror image bars with a link-shaped notch, a primitive die. You place a heated rod between the 2 bars. You strike it with a hammer. You get a rough link. You file it down. You bend it. You join it to the next one. The first chain turned out crooked. The links were different sizes. 3 out of 20 snapped under load. Dan took the chain apart and started over. The second one was better. The third one worked. Horvick looked at the chain and didn't understand what it was for. Dan explained. A chain transmits force from one wheel to another over a distance. More precisely than a belt. More reliable than a gear when the axles aren't parallel. Horvick listened. He nodded. Then he said it was like a bridle, only for metal. Dan laughed and said it was the best explanation he'd ever heard. By the end of the second week, an idea came to Dan that kept him awake at night. A velomobile. Not a bicycle, because a bicycle required tubes, and they didn't make tubes here. But a velomobile. 4 wheels. A wooden frame. Pedals. A chain drive to the rear axle. A very simple differential so the wheels wouldn't lock up on turns. He began to sketch. He had nothing to sketch with and nothing to sketch on. Paper was expensive in this world. He found flat pieces of slate and drew on them with a nail. He would wipe it off with a rag and draw again. Horvick once caught him doing this at night by candlelight. He looked at the drawings. He asked what they were. Dan said it was a vehicle that ran without a horse. Horvick was silent for a moment. Then he said that Dan was either a genius or a madman, and that in either case, he needed to eat more. After that, Grandma Ruth started giving Dan double portions. It took 3 weeks to build the velomobile. Dan worked for Horvick during the day and on his own project at night and early in the morning. He made the frame out of oak planks. He reinforced the joints with iron plates. He took the wheels from an old wagon that Horvick kept in the yard as junk. He turned the hubs on a lathe. He made primitive plain bearings out of bronze rings. He begged Horvick for the bronze in exchange for his labor. He assembled the pedal mechanism from 2 cranks and that very same third of the chain that finally worked properly. The differential was the most complicated part. In his past life, Dan had taken apart and reassembled differentials hundreds of times. He could do it with his eyes closed. But back then, there were precision gears made of hardened steel. Here, he had rough cast pieces of metal and a hammer. He simplified the design to the bare minimum. Not a full differential, but a simple overrunning clutch on one wheel. On a straight stretch, both wheels turn together. When turning, the inner wheel slips. Rough, inefficient, but it works. On the day the velomobile was ready, Dan rolled it out into the yard at dawn. Horvick was still asleep. Grandma Ruth came out to fetch water and stopped in her tracks. Dan sat down on the wooden seat. He grabbed the steering stick. He pressed down on the pedals. The chain tightened. The wheels turned. And off he went. slowly, with a creak, swaying over the bumps in the yard, but he was moving, without a horse, without magic, with nothing but the strength of his legs and the gear ratio. Grandma Ruth dropped the bucket. Dan drove across the yard to the gate. He turned around. It was difficult because the steering was stiff. He rode back. He stopped. He got off. Horvik ran out of the house wearing nothing but his boxers. He stood there and looked at the bike, then at Dan. Then he walked over and touched the frame. He turned the pedal with his hand. He watched the chain turn. He crouched down and peered under the bottom. He saw the overdrive clutch. He studied it for a long time. He stood up and quietly said he needed to sit down. Grandma Ruth brought him a chair right out into the yard. Horvik sat there and looked at the velomobile. Then he said, "This changes everything." Dan shook his head. He said it didn't change anything. It's a toy. One person. Light load. Low speed. The road has to be smooth or it'll fall apart. But it's proof. Proof that you can get around without a horse. And if you can move without a horse using leg power, then you can move without a horse using steam power. Horvik asked what steam power was. Dan pointed to the boiler standing by the smithy, used to heat water. He said that when the water boils, the steam pushes against the lid. If steam pushes against the lid, he said, then steam can push against a piston. And if steam pushes on a piston, then steam can turn a wheel. Horvik listened. His eyes were wide. He said that Dan was definitely a madman, but the kind of madman worth listening to. That same day, Dan took his velomobile out past the Grimsholt gate and rode down the road toward the neighboring village of Bridgewater. It was 4 miles to Bridgewater. On foot, that's 2 hours. On horseback, half an hour. On the velomobile, Dan made it in 40 minutes. The road was rough, and he nearly tipped over twice on the ruts. One pedal came loose, and he fixed it on the side of the road with a rock instead of a hammer. But he made it there. And back. An hour and a half round trip instead of 4. In Bridgewater, people looked at him as if he were an alien. Children ran alongside him, shouting. Adults came out of their houses. One old man crossed himself. Another tried to touch the wheel while it was moving and nearly fell. On the way back, Dan thought, the velomobile is proof of concept. But for real transportation, you need more power than human legs can provide. You need steam. And for steam, you need a boiler. A good, sturdy boiler that can withstand the pressure. And for a boiler, you need a coppersmith. But there's not much copper in Grimsholt. It'll take months, but the groundwork has been laid. That evening, he sat in the smithy eating the stew Grandma Ruth had made. Horvik sat across from him drinking beer. They were silent. Then Horvik spoke. "Kid, I don't know who you are. I don't know where you're from, but I'm old, and my eyes still work. What you're doing isn't blacksmithing. It's something else, something I've never seen in my whole life. And it scares me. Because when people see something they don't understand, they either pray or grab a pitchfork." Dan put down his spoon. He looked at Horvik. And for the first time, he told him the truth. Not all of it, but it was enough. He said he'd come from a distant land. That where he grew up, machines that run without horses are commonplace. That he's neither a wizard nor a spirit. That he's simply a craftsman who knows things they don't know here yet. And that he wants to build these things here because this world needs them. Horvik listened. Then he finished his beer. Then he said, "All right, I'm 62 years old. Ruth and I don't have any children. The blacksmith shop will be gone after I'm gone. If you want to build your crazy contraptions, you'll need a blacksmith shop. It's yours." Dan froze. Horvik raised his hand. He said he wasn't giving it away, but sharing it. That the blacksmith shop would be shared. That he would forge his own things and Dan would forge his. That he was old but not useless. And that if Dan needed an assistant who knew every blacksmith and every merchant within a 50-mile radius, he wouldn't find anyone better than Horvik. Dan held out his hand. Horvik shook it. The old man's hand was like iron. Ruth's grandmother came out of the house with a pie. She looked at them. She said, "Finally," and set the pie on the table. Dan ate the pie and thought about the steam boiler, about the copper pipes, about the pressure valves, about the pistons and connecting rods, about roads. For the first time in 2 weeks in this world, he felt not like a survivor, but like a living person. News of the horseless carriage spread throughout Grimsholt in 2 days. Dan didn't try to spread it. That's just how a small town works. Someone saw it. Someone told the story. Someone embellished it. By the end of the week, the story was growing with details that never existed. Some said the wagon flew. Others said a demon sat inside, turning the wheels. Still others claimed that the new farmhand working for Horvik had sold his soul in exchange for secret knowledge. Dan heard these rumors and paid them no mind. He had other things on his mind. He needed a boiler. Not a blacksmith's boiler for heating water, a real steam boiler, a pressure-tight one, capable of withstanding a pressure of at least 3 atmospheres, with a relief valve so it wouldn't explode, with a coal-fired firebox, with a steam outlet to the piston assembly. In his past life, he had seen dozens of steam engines. He had restored 3, a 1912 Fowler steam tractor, a steamboat, and a small stationary engine from a sawmill dating back to the turn of the century. He knew how they were built down to the last bolt. The problem was the materials. A steam boiler had to be made of copper, or at least good quality iron with copper tubes. There was copper in Grimsholt, but not much, and it was expensive. Horvik said the nearest copper mine was 100 miles to the east in the mountains. The copper was brought in by caravans and sold at the market in the capital. Only crumbs made it to Grimsholt. Dan did the math. For the boiler, he needed about 40 pounds of copper. At local prices, that cost more than Horvik earned in half a year. He didn't have that kind of money. He sat poring over his blueprints on the slate tiles, thinking. And then Brandon Marquette walked into the smithy. The merchant Marquette was the kind of man Dan, in a past life, would have called a shrewd businessman. About 45 years old, sturdy, with a neat beard and piercing eyes, dressed expensively but not ostentatiously. A man of action. He owned 3 trade caravans that traveled between Grimsholt and the capital. Or rather, he used to own them. Before horse prices had risen 8-fold, now he had only 1 caravan left, and that one traveled once every 2 months. Marquette had come to look at the vehicle. He stood in the blacksmith's yard and examined the velomobile in silence. Then he sat down on the seat. He pressed the pedals. He rode 3 steps. He got off and asked Dan if it was possible to make a contraption that carried cargo instead of a single person, without a horse. Dan replied that it was possible, but not with legs, with steam. Marquette didn't know what steam meant in this context. Dan explained it. Simply, without technical details. Water boils, steam creates pressure. The pressure pushes the piston. The piston turns the wheel moves. Marquette listened without interrupting. Then he asked the one question any merchant would ask. How much would it cost, and when would it be ready? Dan told him the truth. He said he needed 40 pounds of copper, good quality iron, tools, an assistant who knew how to cast and solder, and 3 months. Marquette thought it over. 3 months meant 3 caravans he wouldn't be able to send because he had no way to transport them. Or one crazy bet on a guy whom the whole town considered either a genius or a madman. Marquette looked at the velomobile, then at Dan. Then he said he'd provide the copper, and the iron, and the tools. And he'd find a foundryman, but in return, he wanted the first vehicle, and the right to be the first to haul his own cargo in it. Dan agreed. They shook hands. Marquette left. Horvik, who had been listening from the smithy, came out and said that Marquette was a sly fox but kept his word. That if he promised copper, there would be copper. The copper arrived a week later. 42 pounds of sheet copper, slightly greenish, with an uneven surface. But real copper. Dan took a sheet in his hands and almost cried. A foundryman arrived along with the copper, a skinny man in his 30s named Gareth, a man of few words, with scorched hands. He cast copper and bronze for merchant guilds and factories. Marquette hired him for 3 months. Gareth looked at Dan's drawings on the slate tiles. He didn't say anything. Then he asked why the tubes had to be so thin. Dan explained. Thin walls transfer heat faster. More heating surface area with less volume. That means the water boils faster. That means steam sooner. Gareth thought for a moment. Then he said he could do it. Work began. Dan slept 4 hours a night. The rest of the time he was in the forge. He built the boiler from memory, reconstructing in his mind the design of the simplest early 19th century steam engine. Not Watt's machine. Simpler. A single acting cylinder. Steam pushes the piston down. The flywheel uses inertia to pull it back up. Rough, inefficient, but reliable and simple. The boiler was made from copper sheets. Gareth proved to be a master of his craft. His soldering was clean and tight. Dan showed him how to make a double seam to ensure a tight seal. Gareth remembered it on the first try. The main problem was with the pressure valve. If the pressure got too high, the boiler would burst. They needed a safety valve that would open at a certain pressure and release steam. In his past life, it had been a spring-loaded valve. Here, there were no standard springs. Dan came up with something else. A weight on a lever. A heavy lead ball at the end of a copper lever presses down on the valve. When the steam pressure overcomes the weight of the ball, the valve opens. Simple. It's adjusted by moving the ball along the lever. B. The pressure is lower right next to the valve. It gets higher further on. He explained this to Horvik. The old man understood right away.
He said it was like a balance scale.
Only for steam. Dan laughed again. Horvik had a knack for finding spot-on metaphors. The cylinder was the most complicated part. It had to be smooth on the inside. The piston had to move tightly but freely. In a past life, Dan would have put it on a lathe. There was no lathe here. He made the cylinder from a bronze casting. Gareth cast the pipe. Dan polished the inner surface by hand, with a stone, sand, and a rag. For hours on end, day after day. His shoulder ached so badly that he couldn't lift his arm at night. Grandma Ruth rubbed his shoulder with some kind of greasy ointment that stank so badly even the pigs turned away. But it helped. He machined the piston out of iron. He made the seal out of several layers of oiled leather. Not perfect. Steam will seep through. But it'll do for now. The connecting rod and crankshaft took another week. The crankshaft is what converts the piston's reciprocating motion into rotational motion. Simply put, it's the thing that turns a back-and-forth motion into a circular one. Dan forged it himself. Horvik helped hold it in place. Together they spent 12 hours at the anvil.
By dawn, the crankshaft was ready.
Crooked, rough, with burrs, but precise in the dimensions that mattered. Dan made the flywheel from an old millstone, a heavy stone disc. Horvik asked why. Dan explained. The flywheel stores rotational energy. When the piston pushes the wheel, it moves forward. When the piston moves backward, the flywheel continues to spin by inertia and keeps the system from stopping. Horvik nodded. Then he said quietly, "You see the world differently than we do. You see that in every movement there is something that can be stored and used later." It was the most accurate description of a flywheel that Dan had ever heard. The assembly took another 3 days. Dan built the machine right in the blacksmith's yard. Boiler, cylinder, piston, connecting rod, crankshaft, flywheel. Everything mounted on a wooden frame held together with iron bolts. Not on wheels yet, just a stationary engine. First, he had to check that it worked. On the day of the first test, Dan filled the boiler with water. He stoked the firebox with coal. And then he waited. Horvik stood nearby. Gareth stood a little farther away, around the corner.
Grandma Ruth came out onto the porch with a towel in her hands.
Everyone waited. The water heated up slowly. The minutes dragged on. Dan kept an eye on the valve. The weighted lever stood motionless. Then a faint whistle came from under the boiler lid. Steam. The pressure was rising. Dan stood there watching the pressure gauge. There was no pressure gauge. He went by the sound and the way the valve lever trembled. When the whistle became steady, he opened the steam supply to the cylinder. Steam struck the piston. The piston jerked. The connecting rod moved. The crankshaft turned. The flywheel swung heavily. Then it stopped. Dan cursed. Not enough steam. The pressure was too low. He tossed in some coal. He waited. He opened the valve again. The piston jerked harder. The flywheel turned a quarter turn. Then it stopped again. Dan closed the valve. He thought for a moment. The problem was a leak. Steam was escaping through the piston seal. Too much was being lost. He removed the cylinder. He added another layer of leather to the piston. He re-oiled it. He put it back in. He stoked the fire again. He waited again. When the steam flow became steady, he opened the valve.
The piston struck.
The connecting rod pulled. The crankshaft turned. The flywheel swung. It passed the dead center and went through a second revolution, and a third, and a fourth. The engine was running, slowly, heavily, with a wheeze, a whistle, and a knock. But it was running. The piston moved up and down. The crankshaft spun. The flywheel picked up speed. White steam poured from the pipe. Red heat radiated from the firebox. and a sound he didn't even recognize himself burst from Dan's throat. Something between a laugh and a scream. Horvik stood nearby, motionless. He watched the spinning flywheel, the piston moving on its own inside the cylinder, the steam doing what hands or horses or water used to do, and tears streamed down the old blacksmith's cheeks. He wasn't ashamed. He just stood there, crying and watching. Because for the first time in his life, he was seeing fire turn into motion. Grandma Ruth crossed herself. Gareth came around the corner and stood there with his mouth agape. The machine ran for 7 minutes. Then the leather piston seal burned out and the steam began to leak. The flywheel slowed down and came to a stop.
Dan sat down on the ground, right in the dust.
His hands were shaking. 7 minutes. That was enough. Now he knew the principle worked. That the local materials could hold up. That the boiler held pressure. That the valve worked. Everything else was just fine-tuning. Replace the leather with something stronger. Oiled flax. Or asbestos, if he could find any. Grind the cylinder smoother. Make the piston seal multi-layered. It's work. Tedious, long, painstaking work. But work. Not an invention, not a miracle. Just the work of a craftsman. Horvik walked over and put his hand on Dan's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. Grandma Ruth brought tea. The three of them sat drinking tea next to the cooling engine, and no one said a word. Because words weren't needed. Dan spent the next 6 weeks in hell. A pleasant hell. A hell where everything breaks every day, but every day you fix it a little better than yesterday. He replaced the piston ring 11 times. The first 5 attempts were made of leather. They all burned up or slipped off. The 6th attempt, made of oiled linen, lasted 20 minutes. The 7th was a triple layer of graphite-impregnated linen.
He found the graphite by accident. Grandma Ruth brought a piece of soft black stone that she used to clean her pots. Dan looked at it and froze. It was graphite. Natural graphite. The best dry lubricant he knew. He ground the stone into a powder. He impregnated the linen packing with it. He placed it in the cylinder. He started the engine. The seal held for 40 minutes. Then an hour. Then 2. He hugged Grandma Ruth and told her she'd just made a breakthrough in mechanical engineering. She said she had no idea what he was talking about, but if he needed more of those stones, she had a whole bag of them in her pantry. While fine-tuning the engine, Dan was building the undercarriage. He designed the frame for the steam tractor out of oak with an iron skeleton. 4 wheels. The rear ones were drive wheels. The front ones were steering wheels. He ordered the wheels from a wheelwright in Grimsholt. Large, wide, with iron rims. The wheelwright, Tobias, was an old friend of Horvik's. He looked at the blueprints, shook his head, and said he'd never made wheels that wide before. But he'd do it, in 3 weeks for 2 silver coins. Dan agreed. Market paid the money. Dan kept the transmission simple, from the crankshaft via a belt drive to the intermediate shaft. From the intermediate shaft via a chain to the rear axle. 1 speed, no gearbox. Acceleration and braking were controlled by adjusting the steam supply. More steam meant faster speed. Less steam meant slower speeds. No steam at all meant a stop. The brake was a wooden block pressed against the rear wheel rim by a lever. Rough. But it was enough for a speed of 5 miles per hour. He copied the steering mechanism from the design of old steamrollers he'd seen at a museum in Portland. The front axle pivots entirely on a central kingpin. The steering linkage runs from the lever to the axle. You turn the lever, the axle turns, and the wheels turn. The turning radius is enormous, but it's enough for the road. The biggest problem wasn't the engine or the chassis. The biggest problem was water. The steam engine guzzled water like a camel after crossing the desert. 10 minutes of operation used up a bucket of water. An hour of operation used up a barrel. The journey from Grimsholt to the capital took 4 days. This meant that the vehicle had to carry a huge supply of water, or it would have to stop at every stream and every well. Dan chose the latter. On the roof of the tractor, he installed a wooden tank lined with copper on the inside. The tank held enough water for 2 hours of driving. Every 2 hours, a stop to refuel. Not ideal, but better than a horse that needs to be fed, watered, and given rest. A machine doesn't get tired. A machine doesn't sleep. A machine eats only coal and water and keeps going as long as it has both. By the middle of the 6th week, the tractor was assembled.
DN stood in front of it and stared. It was an ugly monster. A wooden frame on 4 wheels. A smokestack protruded from a blacksmith's casing at the front. A water tank hung at the back. In the middle stood a boiler lined with bricks for insulation. The cylinder was bolted to the side. The flywheel jutted out like a huge ear. The entire structure was lashed together with straps, chains, and struts. It creaked in the wind. It reeked of oil and coal. It was beautiful. Market arrived in the morning on the day of their first trip. He stood there watching. Dan could see from his face that the merchant was torn between dread and hope. Horvik was praying.
Grandma Ruth had prepared food for the road.
Gareth stood with his tools at the ready. Dan filled the tank with water. He fired up the boiler. He waited for the pressure to build. 20 minutes. Steam began to escape. The whistle blew steadily. The pressure was normal. He opened the valve. The piston struck. The flywheel began to turn. The belt tightened. The chain rattled. The rear wheels jolted, and the machine began to move. Slowly, with a creak, with a rumble. Smoke poured from the pipe. Mud flew from under the wheels. The tractor crawled across the blacksmith's yard like a sick bear, but it was crawling, on its own, without a horse, without people pushing from behind, on its own. Dan sat in the driver's seat. The driver's seat was a plank nailed across the frame. He held the steering lever with one hand. With the other, he regulated the steam supply. His foot was ready to hit the brake. The tractor pulled out of the blacksmith's gate onto Grimsholt Street. People stopped. They watched. Some ran away. A dog barked. A child began to cry. An old man crossed himself. Dan drove the vehicle down the main street toward the south gate. The speed was about 3 miles per hour.
A pedestrian would have walked faster.
But the truck was carrying a tank of water, a supply of coal, and tools. A load of 300 pounds. No human could have carried that much. No horse in this town could have either, because there were no horses in this town. The wagon passed through the south gate and pulled out onto the road. The road was rough. Ruts, rocks, and potholes. The wagon shook. The frame creaked. One of the boiler's supports cracked, and Dan stopped to reinforce it with a rock wedged under the base. Gareth walked alongside on foot with a bag of tools. Horvik stayed behind in the smithy. Market rode behind on the only donkey he had left. They covered 3 miles in an hour. Then they stopped by a stream. Dan filled the water tank. He added some coal. He checked the seal. They drove on. Another 3 miles. Stop, refuel, check. Onward. By evening, they had traveled 12 miles. On foot, that's 6 hours. By wagon, 4. The difference isn't much, but the wagon was carrying 300 pounds of cargo. A pedestrian carried 30. Market realized this right away. That evening, they set up camp by the road. Dan repaired a cracked support. Gareth was asleep.
Market sat by the fire and did some calculations.
Then he walked over to Dan. And he said what Dan wanted to hear. He said that if this thing could haul 1,000 pounds from Grimsholt to the capital in 4 days instead of 10, he'd order 5 more of them. And he'd pay for everything. Dan said he could manage one. But 5 isn't just 5 vehicles. 5 means a workshop. It means people. It means training. It means a steady supply of copper, iron, and coal. It means a system. Marquette nodded. He said he understood the system. That caravan trade was also a system. And that if Dan built a system, he, Marquette, would build a trade around it. They shook hands a second time. On the way back to Grimsholt, the tractor broke down twice. The first time, the drive belt snapped. Dan replaced it in an hour using a spare piece of leather. The second time, the steam supply valve jammed. Dan spent 2 hours taking it apart on the side of the road. He scalded his hand with steam. He wrapped it in a rag and carried on. Gareth watched him and shook his head. Then he said quietly, "I've seen a lot of mechanics. None of them worked like that.
None of them would climb into a machine that could scald them to death with such a calm expression.
Either you're not afraid of death, or you've already been dying." Dan said nothing, because both options were true. They returned to Grimsholt by evening the next day. Horvik was waiting for them in the blacksmith's yard. And not just Horvik. Standing next to him was a man Dan had never seen before. Tall, slender, wearing a long cloak bearing a coat of arms. A young woman, with red hair tucked under a simple scarf, with freckles on her nose, with tired eyes that held something both hard and fragile at the same time. Horvik stepped forward, and his voice was strange, a little frightened, a little proud. He said, "Dan, "This is Mrs. Irene. She's come from the capital. She wants to see your truck." The woman looked at the tractor trailer, then at Dan, then back at the tractor trailer, and Dan saw that she was biting her nails. A small gesture, nervous, familiar. He didn't know who she was yet, but he could already tell that this woman was carrying a burden that would break men much bigger than him. Ms. Irene asked to see the truck. Not tomorrow, right now. Dan looked at her. Looked at the tractor trailer. The truck was cooling down after the trip. The engine was still warm. He wanted to replace the piston seal. The boiler's support rested on a rock and a rope. But there was something in this woman's eyes that made him not want to argue. He said okay. He tossed some coal into the firebox. He added water. He waited for the pressure to build. The woman stood nearby and watched the boiler. She didn't back away. She didn't wince at she didn't ask any silly questions. She just watched. 20 minutes later, steam started coming out. Dan opened the valve. The piston struck. The flywheel swung. The machine came to life. Irene watched the piston, how it moved inside the cylinder, how the connecting rod pulled the crankshaft, how the crankshaft turned the flywheel. She watched just as Horvick had watched the first time, with the realization that before her was something the world had never seen before. Then she turned to Dan and asked how it worked. Not what it was, not why, how. Dan began to explain. Water boils, steam expands. Pressure pushes the piston. The piston, via the connecting rod, rotates the shaft. The shaft turns the wheels. She listened. She nodded. Then she asked a question that surprised him. She asked why steam and not wind? Or water? Dan thought for a moment. He explained. Wind is unpredictable. A water wheel is tied to the river. But steam can be produced anywhere. All you need is fire and water. That means the machine is free. It isn't tied to any one place. It goes wherever it wants. Irene was silent for a long time after he said that. Then she repeated it quietly. Free. Goes wherever it wants. And Dan saw something change in her expression. As if those words hadn't just entered her mind but had gone deeper. She asked for a ride. Dan said the tractor was in poor condition after the trip, that the boiler mount was cracked, that he wasn't sure about the steering mechanism. She said she understood the risk. Dan looked at Horvick. The old man shrugged. Dan sat her down next to him on the bench, told her to hold on to the frame. He turned on the steam. The tractor started moving. They drove across the yard, through the gate, down the street past the houses. People stopped and watched. Irene sat up straight. She didn't flinch from the jolting. She didn't grab the sides. She looked ahead at the road unfolding before her at a slow jog's pace. And she smiled. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, but she was smiling. They drove to the end of the street and turned back. Dan stopped the car. Irene got out. She pulled her raincoat tight. She turned to Dan and said, I want you to come to the capital. Dan asked why. She said, because my kingdom is dying. We have no horses. No caravans. The villages are starving. The cities are emptying. The roads have become more dangerous than the forests. I need someone who can do what I just saw. And do it not just for one forge, but for the whole country. Dan was silent. Horvick was silent. Market, who had been listening from around the corner, peeked out and remained silent as well. Then Dan asked, My lady, who are you really? She hesitated. Then she removed a simple scarf from her head, and Dan saw a thin golden headband in her hair. Small. Simple. Without stones. But a headband. She said, My name is Isara. I am the Queen of Veldmar. Horvick turned pale. He began to drop to one knee. She stopped him with a gesture. She said it wasn't necessary, that she had come not as a queen, but as a woman seeking a way to save her people. Dan stood there looking at her. 22 years old. A widow. The queen of a country falling apart. She had come to a backwater town in plain clothes, without an entourage, because she'd heard about a madman with an iron cart and decided to check it out for herself. He'd seen this kind of person in a past life. Small business owners who load their own goods at 4 in the morning because they can't afford a loader. Who don't sleep or eat but never give up. who carry everything on their own. Isara was like that. Only instead of a business, she had an entire kingdom. He said, "Your Majesty, I'm a mechanic. Not a mage, not a warrior, not a lord. I have one machine that breaks down every 2 hours, and a head full of 100 more machines like that. But each one represents months of work, materials, people, money. I can't just snap my fingers and do everything at once." She said she wasn't expecting a miracle, that she was expecting a plan. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said, "All right, here's the plan. First, a workshop in the capital, a big one, with a forge, anvils, tools, and a place for assembly. Second, people, blacksmiths, carpenters, and foundry workers. I'll train them. Third, materials, copper, iron, coal, and wood, a steady supply. Fourth, time. At least half a year before we have our first tangible result to show. A year before we have something that will really change the situation." She listened. Then she said, "I'll provide the workshop. I'll find the people. I'll supply the materials. Time? There's no time, but I'll find it." Then she looked him in the eyes and asked, "Why are you doing this? You could sell your machine to the merchant Marquette and live comfortably. Why do you want my dying kingdom?" Dan was silent for a long time. Then he told the truth. Not all of it, but the part that mattered. He said that in his previous life, he had repaired 1,000 cars, and not a single one of them changed anything. They just drove, from point A to point B. Here, his car could ensure that the village didn't go hungry, that a sick child could get to a doctor, that people wouldn't die because there's a road between them and help that's impossible to traverse. That's why. Isara looked at him, and Dan saw something flicker across her face, as if, inside this weary, exhausted woman, something small and forgotten had raised its head. Hope. She held out her hand. Dan shook it. Her hand was small and cold, and there were traces of ink on her fingers. A queen who writes her own decrees, either because she doesn't trust the scribes or because there are no scribes left. She left the next morning. She had only one guard with her, an older swordsman with a scar on his face. Before leaving, she approached Dan and said, "In a month, there will be a fair in the capital. Merchants from all over the kingdom, lords, ambassadors. If you bring your machine there and show that it works, I'll be able to convince the council to grant you everything you ask for. If not, then no." She left. Dan stood there watching her go. Marquette walked over and stood beside him. He said, "Do you realize what just happened?" Dan said yes. Marquette said, "No, you don't understand. Queen Isara of Valdemar has just arrived in Grimsholt in person. That means things in the kingdom are worse than anyone thinks. She didn't send a messenger. She didn't send a minister. She came herself. That means she has no one left she trusts, or that those she trusted don't believe in what you're doing." Dan looked at him. Marquette continued, "And that means that if you fail at the fair, you won't just be letting yourself down. You'll be letting her down, and then she won't be forgiven. The Council of Lords is already sharpening its teeth. The Equestrian Guild wants a regent. If the queen bets on a madman from the backwoods and that madman fails..." Dan raised his hand. He said he understood. Marquette nodded. Then he smiled, for the first time in a long while. He said, "Then let's get to work. 1 month, 30 days. Dan made a mental list. The tractor needs to be rebuilt. The frame needs to be reinforced. The boiler needs to be checked for cracks. The wheels need to be replaced with new ones. The steering mechanism needs to be redesigned. Add a cargo platform in the back. Build a rain canopy. And so that the whole thing wouldn't just run, but would look the part. So that lords and merchants and ambassadors wouldn't laugh, but would fall silent." He started that very day. Horvik worked alongside him, in silence. The old man understood what was happening, that the stakes had changed, that this was no longer just repairing a mill or building a toy on wheels. This was a chance for an entire country, and for an old blacksmith from a backwater town who had spent his whole life forging nails and horseshoes. For the first time in his life, he was doing something that history would remember. Gareth worked on the casting, new parts for the boiler, new bronze wheel bushings, a new cylinder, wider, deeper, with a smoother inner surface. Marquette hired 2 carpenters for the frame, sturdy men who built wagons for caravans. They looked at Dan's blueprints and shook their heads. Then they got to work, because Marquette paid well, and because it was interesting. Dan slept for 3 hours at a time. Grandma Ruth brought food to the smithy because he forgot to come out. She'd set a bowl next to him and wait for him to eat. She wouldn't leave. She said that if he collapsed from hunger, she wouldn't be able to lift him because her back wasn't what it used to be. Dan ate. He worked. He ate. He worked. On the 15th day, the new tractor was half finished. The frame was mounted on wheels. The boiler was installed. The cylinder was in place. All that remained was the transmission, the bodywork, and the steering. And then one man came into the workshop. Dan heard a noise and came out of the room. In the yard stood 3 men in dark clothes. One was holding a torch. The other 2 were standing by the tractor. One of them was pouring something from a jug onto the frame. Oil. Dan realized it instantly. They had come to burn the truck. He shouted. The man with the torch turned around. Dan grabbed the first thing that came to hand, an iron rod for stirring coals. Long, heavy, red hot at the end because it had been lying by the forge. He lunged forward. Without thinking, without planning, pure adrenaline and rage. It was his car, his months of work, his burned hands and sleepless nights. The man with the jug jumped back. The second one drew a knife. Dan struck the hand holding the knife with the poker. Without aiming, the rod struck his wrist. The man dropped the knife and screamed. The third man, holding the torch, threw it toward the tractor. The torch fell to the ground before it reached its target. The oil on the frame didn't catch fire. Dan stood between them and the truck, with a red-hot rod in his hands, his face contorted with rage. Horvick ran out of the house with an axe. Gareth appeared from around the corner with a hammer. The 3 men in the dark exchanged glances and ran off. They vanished into the night. Dan stood there, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. Horvick approached. He looked at the oil stains on the frame, at the knife on the ground, at the torch. Then he looked at Dan and said, "It's begun." Market arrived in the morning. He looked at the knife. He turned it over in his hands. There was a symbol on the handle, crossed horseshoes. The symbol of Tarval's Equestrian Guild. Market placed the knife on the table. He looked at Dan. He said, "These were Cassian Tarval's men, the head of the Equestrian Guild, the richest man in the 3 kingdoms. His fortune rests on horses. And you're building a world without horses." Dan said he wasn't building a world without horses, that he was building a world where there's a choice. Market smirked. He said that to Tarval it was all the same. Then he grew serious. He said that now Dan needed protection, that he'd find people, and that until the fair the truck couldn't be left unattended for even a minute. Dan nodded. He looked at the tractor. He'd wiped off the oil. The frame was undamaged. The work continues. 15 days until the fair. The Equestrian Guild knows about him. The Queen is counting on him. And he stands in the smithy with his hands scorched, a hammer in hand, doing the only thing he knows how to do. He builds. 15 days until the fair have turned into 15 days without sleep. Dan worked so hard that Grandma Ruth stopped calling him to the table and simply left his bowls by the forge. He ate standing up, using one hand while holding a file or a hammer in the other. Market sent 2 guards, former soldiers, burly men who took turns sitting at the smithy gate day and night. After the attack, Dan hadn't slept for 3 nights in a row. Not out of fear, out of anger. Anger was good fuel. The new tractor was taking shape day by day. An oak frame reinforced with iron strips at the corners. 4 wheels with wide rims and bronze hubs. The boiler had been overhauled and pressure tested. A new cylinder with a triple seal made of graphite-impregnated flax. A dual chain transmission. And a cargo platform in the back capable of carrying 800 pounds. On the 10th day, Dan added something that wasn't on the first prototype. A canopy over the driver's seat. Made of wood. With a copper roof. And a seat. A real seat, not just a plank. With leather upholstery and a backrest. Horwick asked why waste time on comfort when the car just needed to run. Dan replied. He said the car would drive past lords, merchants, and ambassadors. And the first thing they'd see wouldn't be a piston or a boiler. The first thing they'll see is how the driver is seated. If he's sitting on a plank like a peasant on a cart, they'll think it's a cart. If he's sitting in a chair like a captain on a ship, they'll think it's a ship. Horvick looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You're not just building a machine. You're building how people see it. Dan nodded. He said that in the world he came from, that's called marketing, and that marketing is sometimes more important than engineering. On the 12th day, the tractor was ready. Dan took it for a test drive out of town, 5 miles there and back. The vehicle ran smoother than the first prototype. The new wheels held the road well. The new seal didn't leak steam. Speed, 4 miles per hour. With a 500-pound load, 3.5. Not fast, but steady. No stops except to refill with water every 2 hours. On the 13th day, Dan loaded the tractor. Market provided the cargo, 10 sacks of grain, 5 barrels of salt, and 3 crates of metal tools. The total weight was about 700 pounds. The vehicle took the load and didn't sag. Dan set off, more slowly, 3 miles an hour. But he was moving, and on the road, he passed a peddler pushing a handcart. The peddler stood there, staring with his mouth agape. Then he ran after the wagon, shouting questions. Dan didn't stop. On the 14th day, they left Grimsholt for the capital. Dan was at the wheel. Gareth sat next to the tools. Horvik was on the cargo bed with a supply of coal and water. Market rode ahead on a donkey, clearing the road and warning oncoming traffic. Grandma Ruth stood at the smithy gate, waving. In her hand, she held a bag of pies for the journey. The journey to the capital, Valkheim, took 4 days, 120 miles, over rough roads with ruts, rocks, and fords across streams. The wagon broke down 3 times. The first time was on the 2nd day. The chain slipped from the sprocket. Dan spent half an hour fixing it. The second time was later that same day, toward evening. One of the wooden spokes on the rear wheel snapped. Dan carved a replacement from a branch of a roadside oak tree and inserted it into place. Rough but sturdy. The third time was on the 3rd day. The steam pipe got clogged, scale from hard water. Dan took the pipe apart, cleaned it, and put it back together. Every breakdown was a lesson. Dan took it all in. He kept track of it all in his head. The chain needs a tensioner. The wheels need to be solid, without spokes. The water needs to be filtered or allowed to settle before filling the tank. A solution was already taking shape for every problem. Dozens of people saw them on the road. Farmers stopped in the fields and watched. Children ran alongside them. In one village, the village head came out and demanded an explanation of what kind of devilry was traveling through his land. Marquette showed his trade license and explained that this was a new method of transporting cargo. The village head didn't believe him, but let them pass. In another village, an old woman threw a rock at the vehicle and screamed about evil spirits. The rock hit the boiler and bounced off. No one was hurt. Dan didn't stop. By evening on the 4th day, they saw Valkheim. The capital of Veldmar stood on a hill at the confluence of 2 rivers. Stone walls, towers, dark slate roofs. Smoke rising from hundreds of chimneys. The city was 10 times larger than Grimsholt, and 10 times dirtier. They entered through the south gate. The guards let them through because Marquette showed the royal charter that Isara had left behind before leaving Grimsholt. A prudent woman. The truck drove through the streets of the capital, and the city came to a standstill. People came out of their houses. Shopkeepers dropped their wares. Children ran in a crowd. Dogs barked. 3 guards tried to stop the carriage, but Marquette showed the letter again, and they stepped aside. Dan drove the carriage down the main street toward the market square. The speed was 2 miles per hour, slower than usual because the streets were narrow and crowded with people. The steam whistle blew. Smoke billowed from the chimney. The wheels clattered over the cobblestones. It wasn't just an entrance, it was a spectacle. By the time they reached the market square, a crowd of several hundred people was following them. Market arranged a place to park. Dan stopped the car. He turned off the engine. He jumped out of the driver's seat. And he saw Isara standing on the balcony of the building across the street. No longer in plain clothes. In a royal gown with a delicate crown upon her auburn hair. Standing beside her were people in fine attire. Advisors, lords, ambassadors. She looked at the truck, and at Dan, and gave a barely perceptible nod. The fair was set to begin tomorrow. That evening, a messenger from the Queen came to Dan. A young man in livery. He handed him a note. The handwriting was small and neat. The ink was fresh. The note was short. Isara wrote that tomorrow at noon there would be a demonstration in the square in front of the council and the guests. that Dan had to show everything the machine was capable of, and that everything depended on it. Dan reread the note. He folded it. He put it in his pocket. He looked at the tractor. The machine was standing in the square surrounded by onlookers. Market's guards wouldn't let anyone come within 10 steps. Dan spent the evening checking every single part. The boiler, the cylinder, the piston, the chain, the wheels, the steering, the brakes. Everything. Every bolt, every seam, every joint. Horvick helped in silence. Gareth held the lantern. Sometime after midnight, Dan finished. He sat down on the ground next to the machine. Horvick sat down beside him, so did Gareth. The three men sat in the darkness next to the iron monster that smelled of coal, oil, and copper. Horvick asked, "Ready?" Dan said the car was ready. Horvick shook his head. "I didn't ask about the machine," he said. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he said he didn't know, that in his past life he'd shown machines at exhibitions dozens of times. But back then, if a machine broke down, people would just walk away. Here, if the machine breaks down, people will decide that it's proof it never worked in the first place, and the queen will lose her throne. Horvick put his hand on Dan's shoulder. He said the machine wouldn't break down, because it had been built by the best craftsmen he'd seen in 60 years. The morning of the fair was sunny. The market square was packed. Hundreds of people, maybe 1,000. Merchants and artisans and common folk, and guards and lords in expensive cloaks, and ladies in dresses and children on their fathers' shoulders. Isara sat on the balcony of the council building with the councilors. Next to her, Dan noticed a man he hadn't seen before. Tall, gray-haired, with a neat beard and a face that radiated wealth and power. The man looked at the tractor with an expression that Dan read instantly: contempt. And behind that contempt, a thin streak of fear. Market approached and whispered, "That's Cassian Tarvel, head of the Equestrian Guild, the Queen's second cousin, the very man whose men came to burn your car." Dan looked at Tarvel. Tarvel looked at Dan. Their eyes met across the square, and Dan felt something cold. Not a threat. Worse. Confidence. Tarvel was certain the car would fail, or that he would make sure it failed. At noon, Isara stood up and addressed the square. Her voice was steady and firm. She spoke of the crisis, of the horses that were no longer there, of the caravans that no longer traveled, of the villages that were starving, of how the kingdom of Weldmar must find a new path or perish, and of how today she would show them that path. She nodded to Dan. He was standing next to the machine. His hands were covered in oil. His shirt was stained with soot. Horvick and Gareth stood nearby. Dan didn't give a speech. He fired up the boiler. The crowd watched as smoke billowed from the chimney, as the steam whistled, as the valve lever trembled. Dan sat down in the driver's seat. He opened the valve. The piston struck. The flywheel turned. The tractor began to move. The crowd gasped. A single sound from 1,000 throats. Dan drove the machine in a circle along the edge of the square, slowly, confidently. The tractor ran smoothly. The steam whistled rhythmically. The wheels rumbled over the stone. People stepped back to make way. Some crossed themselves. Some laughed. Some stood silently with their mouths agape. Dan completed a full circle. He stopped at the loading dock. Marquette and his assistants began loading the sacks and barrels. 700 pounds. The crowd watched. Dan set off again. With the load. The machine moved more slowly, more heavily, but it moved. Another lap. Dan saw the faces. He saw their eyes change. He saw fear and disbelief turn into understanding. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't magic. It was iron and steam and fire. And it worked. He stopped the tractor in front of the council balcony. He looked up. Isara was standing there, her hands clenched into fists. Her eyes were shining. Next to her, Cassian Tarvel sat motionless. His expression hadn't changed, but the knuckles of his fingers gripping the armrest of his chair were white. The square erupted with noise. People were shouting and clapping and jostling to get closer. The guards were barely holding the crowd back. Dan jumped down from the truck. His legs were shaking, not from fatigue but from relief. Horvick walked over and hugged him, tightly like a father. He didn't say a word. Garrett stood nearby, smiling. Market was already talking to 3 merchants at once, and his voice sounded so pleased that Dan could hear him across the entire square. That evening, Dan was summoned to the palace, a small room with a fireplace. Isara was sitting alone. No advisors, no servants, just a guard at the door. She gestured for Dan to sit down. He sat down. The chair was soft, and he almost groaned with pleasure. For a week, he hadn't sat on anything softer than a wooden plank. Isara said that the council had voted. 7 votes in favor, 3 against, 2 abstentions. Dan would receive a workshop in the capital, funding for a year, the right to recruit people, a royal charter protecting his work from interference by the guilds. Dan was silent. Then he asked who had voted against it. Isara smiled wearily. She said he'd figure it out. Dan nodded. Tarvel, and 2 of his men. Isara paused. Then she said quietly, "You know that Tarvel is my relative, that he was regent, that half the court fears him and the other half owes him. I can't just get rid of him. But today, you gave me something I didn't have before. Power. Not a sword or gold. The power of fact. The machine was driving. Everyone saw it. And now, anyone who says it doesn't work will look like a fool." Dan said that 1 car is nothing, that we need dozens, hundreds, and roads for them to travel on, and mechanics to repair them. Isara nodded. She said she knew, and that was exactly why he was here. She stood up, walked over to the window, looked down at the city below. Then she said without turning around, "Daniel, I've been ruling this kingdom for 3 years. For 3 years, every day, someone has come and said that all is lost, that there are no horses, that there are no roads, that there is no money, that there is no hope. Today, for the first time, someone came and said there is a way out, and showed it. Not with words, but with action." She turned around, and Dan saw a single tear running down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand, like a child. Dan stood up. He said he wouldn't let her down. She nodded. She said she knew, and that tomorrow morning they'd show him the workshop. The workshop turned out to be an old carriage house on the eastern edge of Valkheim. A large stone building with a high ceiling and wide gates through which teams of 6 horses had once driven. Now there were no horses. The stalls stood empty. The hay had rotted. The roof was leaking in 3 places. But the walls were sturdy. The floor was stone. And there was enough room for 4 draft horses at once. Dan stood in the middle of this empty space and saw not ruins but the future. Here would be the forge. Here would be the anvil. Here would be the assembly area. There would be the materials storage. In the corner, a place for blueprints. Next to it would be a workbench for precision work. He began setting up the space that very same day. Horvik arrived from Grimsholt a week later. He didn't want to abandon his own smithy. He left a journeyman in charge. But he said he'd be traveling back and forth, once every 2 weeks. Dan said that soon it wouldn't be a donkey hauling him, but a steam tractor. Horvik grumbled that he wasn't crazy enough to get on that thing at full speed. 3 days later, he got on. The first apprentices arrived 10 days later. 5 of them. The Queen sent 2, young men from the Royal Guard who'd been discharged due to injuries. One was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The other had a limp. But they had their hands, and their minds were sharp. Market sent 2, the sons of his workers. They were sturdy lads, used to hard labor. And one came on his own, a skinny 17-year-old who had stood at the workshop gate for 3 days, watching. On the 4th day, Dan went out to him and asked what he wanted. The boy said he wanted to learn, that he'd seen the machine in the square, and that since then he couldn't think of anything else. Dan asked his name. The boy said Thomas Gray. Dan let him in. Teaching was harder than building. Dan was used to working alone or with people who already understood the basics. Here he was starting from scratch. These people didn't know what a piston was. They didn't know what a gear ratio was. They didn't know the difference between copper and bronze by sound. He taught them from the very beginning. He demonstrated. He explained. He let them try. He waited until they broke it. He demonstrated again. Horvik helped. The old man turned out to be a patient teacher. When Dan started to get annoyed because he'd explained something for the third time and the student was still missing the mark, Horvick would step in and say calmly, "Look here, like this. Can you feel it? No, you can't. One more time. There. Now you can feel it. Good." A month later, 5 students could take apart and reassemble a steam cylinder on their own. Not quickly, not perfectly, but correctly. Thomas Gray turned out to be the best. The guy had golden hands and some kind of innate feel for metal. He'd pick up a blank, and within a minute, he'd know where it would crack under stress. Dan looked at him and saw himself, 20 years ago, in his father's garage, with that same hungry look in his eyes. Alongside his studies, Dan was building a second tractor, an improved one, taking into account all the mistakes of the first. The frame was now made of an iron skeleton clad in oak, rather than the other way around. The boiler was a third larger. The cylinder was wider. The gasket was 4-layered. The chain drive featured a spring-loaded lever tensioner. The wheels were solid, made of laminated oak with iron rims and bronze hubs. And most importantly, the cargo platform now held 1,200 pounds. Marquette booked the first trip, to Grimsholt and back. The cargo? 10 barrels of salt for the mountain villages that hadn't seen salt in 4 months. The price of salt in the mountains had risen 12-fold. People were salting their food with ash. The children were sick. Marquette saw this as both an act of charity and a business opportunity. Salt that cost a copper coin in the capital was worth a silver coin in the mountains. If delivered quickly and cheaply, the profit would pay for 10 wagons. Dan agreed. He made the first trip himself, with Garrett and Thomas. 4 days to Grimsholt, loading. 2 days to the mountain village of Stonebridge. The road into the mountains was terrifying. Narrow, rocky, with a cliff on one side. The truck crawled along it at a walking pace. The engine roared on the uphills. The boiler devoured coal 3 times faster than on the plains. Once, a rear wheel slipped off the edge of the road, and the truck tilted so sharply that Dan thought they were going to roll over. Thomas turned pale. Gareth jumped out. Dan opened the throttle wide, and the truck jerked itself back onto the road. Dan's hands shook for an hour afterward, but they made it. When the truck crawled into Stonebridge and Dan opened the cargo bed, and the people saw the barrels of salt, the village fell silent. Then an old woman stepped forward. She reached out her hand. She touched a barrel. She opened the lid. She stuck her finger into the salt. She tasted it, and she screamed. Not a word, just a scream, and the village screamed along with her. Dan stood there watching as people hugged the barrels of salt, as a mother scooped a handful into a little bag and pressed it to her chest. As an old man sniffed the salt and wept. Salt. Ordinary salt. In his past life, he'd bought it for $1 at the supermarket and hadn't given it a second thought. Here it was life itself. Thomas stood beside him. He said quietly, "This is why we're doing this." Dan nodded. On the way back, the truck broke down badly. On the descent from the mountain, the brake failed. The wooden brake shoe cracked, and the truck rolled downhill on its own, picking up speed. Dan cut off the steam supply. He shut down the furnace. But the car kept rolling by inertia and was gaining speed. The road sloped downward. A cliff on the right, a rock face on the left. Dan let go of the steering wheel. He grabbed an iron rod and jammed it between the spokes of the front wheel. The impact was so severe that the rod was wrenched from his hands and flung into the bushes. But the wheel locked up. The car spun around. It came to a stop across the road. The front wheel was broken. 2 spokes were knocked out. The rim was bent. Dan sat in the driver's seat and looked at the cliff 10 steps away. Then he got out. He inspected the damage. He said, "We need a disc brake. A steel one. With a mechanical actuator. No more wooden brake shoes." Thomas asked what a disc brake was. Dan explained, "A steel disc on the axle. 2 brake shoes clamped down on it from both sides with a lever. Large contact area. Greater braking force. Doesn't rot. Doesn't crack." Thomas listened. He took it all in. They spent 2 days repairing the wheel on the side of the road. They carved new spokes from mountain ash. They straightened the rim with stones. They made it to Grimsholt. From there to the capital. 8 days instead of 4. But they made it. At the workshop, Dan's first task was to sit down at the drawing board for a disc brake. Then he worked on the design for an improved boiler with exhaust steam used to preheat the water. Then he worked on the design for a new type of wheel, a solid cast iron wheel instead of a wooden one with spokes. Every breakdown gave rise to an improvement. Every problem pushed him forward. 2 months later, Dan had 3 locomotives in the capital. The first was the old one from Grimsholt. The second was the new, improved model. The third was being built by his apprentices under his guidance, almost entirely on their own. Thomas assembled the transmission. Gareth cast the parts. Horvik forged the frame. Dan merely checked and made corrections. Market launched regular train. 2 tractor trailers ran between the capital and Grimsholt, once a week, carrying cargo both ways. Grain down from the mountains, salt and tools up the mountains. Travel time was cut from 10 days to 4. Transportation costs were halved. Market was making money. But something else was more important than money. The villages along the route came to life. A shop opened in Stonebridge. A mill began operating in Bridgewater. In Grimsholt, Horvik's blacksmith shop orders 3 months in advance. And then Maggie arrived. Margaret Marquette walked into the workshop as if she were entering her own home. No knock, no greeting. She walked past the apprentices, past the tractor under construction, past Horvik. She stopped in front of Dan, who was lying under the second tractor, replacing a chain sprocket. He saw a pair of boots, nice boots, women's boots, covered in road mud up to the knee. Then he saw a skirt. Then he saw a face looking down at him with an expression he would describe as businesslike impatience. Tall, dark hair in a tight braid, dark piercing eyes. She looked about 24. She said, "You're Dan Hopper. I'm Margaret Market, Brandon's daughter. He sent me because he broke his leg. Fell off a donkey. I'm running his business now, including yours. Get up. We need to talk." Dan crawled out from under the tractor trailer. He wiped his hands with a rag. He looked at her. She was half a head taller than him. Or maybe it was just that Dan Hopper's body wasn't very tall. He still hadn't quite gotten used to it. Maggie. That's what she asked to be called. Maggie took a stack of papers out of her bag and spread them out on the workbench right on top of Dan's blueprints. He opened his mouth to object. She raised her hand. She said his blueprints could wait. But this wouldn't wait. These were bills. The workshop's expenses for 2 months. Copper, iron, coal, wood, food for the apprentices, Gareth's wages, maintenance for 3 tractor trailers, repairs, spare parts. The total amount, which Dan hadn't even bothered to calculate because there was no one to do it. Maggie had done the math, and the numbers were bad. Expenses were 4 times higher than revenue from transport. Marquette was paying out of his own pocket. Royal funding covered a third. The rest was going into debt. "This can't go on," Maggie said. "You're a great master, but you're a terrible manager. You spend copper as if it grew on trees. Your apprentices break their tools faster than you can make them. Your draft horses haul cargo along a route I drove myself. There are 3 extra miles because you go around the hill instead of going over the pass. 3 miles is an extra hour and a half, and an extra 20 pounds of coal per trip." Dan stood there listening. He wanted to object, to say the hill was too steep, that the tractor wouldn't make it, that he'd tried. Maggie pulled out another piece of paper, a map, hand-drawn but accurate, with elevations, gradients, and distances. She pointed it out. The pass was steep for a short stretch, 200 steps. If he accelerated the tractor to maximum speed on the approach, the flywheel's momentum would carry it over the highest point. She'd done the math. According to her figures, the truck could make it. Dan looked at the map, at the calculations, at this woman who, in a week, had studied his route and found an optimization he himself had overlooked. Because he'd been thinking about the truck, and she'd been thinking about the road. He said he'd try. Maggie said she wouldn't try, she'd do it. Because starting tomorrow, she'd be in charge of sales, and all routes would go through her. Dan looked at Horvik. Horvik shrugged. There was something resembling sympathy on his face. Maggie turned out to be right about the pass. The tractor trailer made it through. Barely. With a roar and a cloud of smoke. But it made it through. The savings on the route were exactly as much as she'd said. Dan was both annoyed and impressed. From that day on, the workshop was split into 2 parts. Dan built the trucks. Maggie built the business. She recalculated all the expenses. She found a new coal supplier who sold it a third cheaper. She negotiated with the foundry for a steady supply of bronze at wholesale prices. She drew up a schedule of trips. She found new customers. After a month, expenses and revenue balanced out. After 2 months, there was a profit. A small one, but a profit nonetheless. Market Sr. was bedridden with a broken leg and received reports from his daughter. Dan once saw the look on his face as he read the numbers. The old merchant was smiling, not because of the profit. It was because his daughter was doing better than he was. Maggie and Dan argued every day. She said he was spending too much copper on experiments. He said there would be no new machines without experiments. She said new machines were pointless if there was no money to build them. He said money was pointless if the machines didn't get better. They argued loudly and for a long time, and the students had gotten used to leaving the workshop during these arguments. Horvik sat and drank tea. He said it reminded him of his youth with Ruth. But between the arguments there was work. And when it came to work, they were on the same page. Maggie saw what Dan didn't see. People, roads, markets, politics. Dan saw what Maggie didn't see. Mechanisms, materials, possibilities. Together they saw the system. One evening, after yet another argument over copper expenses, Maggie sat alone in the workshop, doing calculations. Dan returned for a tool he'd forgotten. He saw her by candlelight, dark circles under her eyes, her lips pressed together. Her fingers were stained with ink. She didn't notice him. He stood there for a second. Then he left, and returned 10 minutes later with a mug of hot tea from Grandma Ruth, who had come along with Horvik. He set the mug down next to the papers. Maggie looked up. She looked at the mug, then at him. She didn't say a word. But the next morning she didn't snap at him. For 2 days. Then she started again. But something had changed. In her 3rd month of work in the capital, Sister Lillian Cord arrived. She came to the studio in the morning with a large leather bag that turned out to be stuffed with notebooks. A full-figured woman with a round, kind face and hands stained with ink and oil. She was a nun of the Order of the Holy Wheel, a small order attached to a convent in the capital. They were dedicated to preserving old records and praying for artisans. Lillian introduced herself. She said she'd heard about his machines, that she wanted to take a look, that she might be able to help. Dan asked how. She opened her bag and took out a notebook. She flipped it open. And Dan froze. On the page was a drawing, an old one. Neat. Copied from something even older. A drawing of a steam cylinder. With dimensions. With annotations. With pressure calculations. Dan took the notebook. His hands weren't shaking, but only because he'd forced them not to. This drawing was accurate. Not a rough sketch. Not a naive attempt. A real engineering drawing. Made by someone who knew what they were doing. He asked where it came from. Lillian said it was from the monastery archives. That these drawings had been kept there for 300 years. That they had been banned. That orders had been given to destroy them. But the monks of the order had hidden copies. And ever since, each generation had copied them anew. In secret. She herself had been copying them since she was 12. Without understanding most of it. But she copied them anyway. Because she felt it was important. Dan leafed through the notebook. Drawing after drawing. A steam cylinder. A gear transmission. A valve mechanism. A water tube boiler. It was a steam engine. A complete design. From 300 years ago. This world had already known steam engines. And someone had destroyed them. He looked up at Lillian. She was standing there, looking at him. And in her eyes was something he'd seen only once before, in Thomas. Hunger. A hunger for knowledge. For understanding. For 12 years, she'd been redrawing blueprints she didn't understand. Because she sensed that behind those lines and numbers lay something immense. And now there was a man who could explain it. Dan said, "Sit down." And he began to explain. He explained for 4 hours. Lillian listened without interrupting. She wrote everything down. She asked questions that were not just clever but precise. She didn't ask what it did, but why it did it that way and not another. When he explained how a piston works, she said quietly, "I looked at this drawing for 12 years and didn't understand it. But you explained it in 10 minutes. And I want to cry, out of joy and out of anger that I wasted 12 years. Dan shook his head. He said it wasn't a waste, that without her 12 years, these blueprints wouldn't exist anymore, that she had preserved knowledge that someone had tried to destroy, and that this was more important than any machine he could build. Lillian looked at him. Then she quickly turned away. But Dan had noticed that her eyes were shining. She started coming every day. In the morning, with her notebooks, with questions, with endless patience and a thirst for knowledge. Dan taught her, and he learned himself. Because the ancient drawings contained solutions he didn't know, things this world had invented on its own, without Watt and Stevenson, by different paths but to the same results. The drawing that frightened Dan was on the last page of Lillian's third notebook. It was different from the rest. A different hand, a different style, more confident lines, more precise measurements, and notes. Notes in a language Lillian didn't know, and Dan didn't know either. But he recognized the letters, the Latin alphabet, not of this world, of his world. The drawing depicted a double-acting steam engine. Steam pushes the piston in both directions. This doubles the power while maintaining the same cylinder size. A design that, in his world, was invented by James Watt in 1782. But here, someone else had invented it, 300 years ago, and they'd written notes in Latin script. Dan sat there staring at the blueprint until the candle had burned down halfway. Then he put the notebook away. He lay down on the bed, stared at the ceiling, and thought. He wasn't the first. Someone before him, someone from his world or from a world similar to his, had been here, building, drawing, and then it was all destroyed. He didn't tell anyone about it. Not yet. In the morning, he went back to work. But the question remained: who, when, and most importantly, why had everything been destroyed, and by whom? Lillian noticed that he had changed. She asked what had happened. Dan said he'd found something interesting in the blueprints. He asked her to find out everything she could from the monastery archives about the time when the originals were made, who made them, and under what circumstances, what happened afterward. Lillian nodded. She went to the monastery. She returned 3 days later with new information. The information was alarming. 300 years ago, during the final decades of the ancient empire, there was an engineering guild. It was called the Brotherhood of the Iron Road. They built steam engines, steam-powered carriages, and steam pumps for mines. They had workshops in 5 cities, with about 200 master craftsmen and apprentices. Then, overnight, it all came to an end. The workshops were burned down, and the blueprints were confiscated. Most of the master craftsmen were executed. The rest fled and disappeared. That is the official version in the chronicles. The Brotherhood practiced forbidden magic, and the gods punished them. But Lillian found another entry in the archives. A small, almost faded note written by one of the monks of that time. The monk wrote that the executions were not organized by the emperor, that a secret council was behind them. The monk called them the Order of the Silent Wheel. He wrote that they believed machines would destroy the world's order, that movement that was too fast would sever the bonds between people, that a world moving faster than a person walks would lose its soul, and that they destroyed the Brotherhood to save the world from itself. Dan listened. Then he asked, "This order, does it still exist?" Lillian paused. Then she said she didn't know, that there were no records of it after that time. But the lack of records could mean 2 things. Either the order had disappeared, or it had become better at hiding. Dan nodded. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "We'll keep working, but quietly, without drawing unnecessary attention." Lillian looked at him. She said that he had 3 wagons traveling the kingdom's roads, and that it wouldn't be possible to stay quiet anymore. Dan smirked. She was right. That same month, 2 things happened that changed the situation. First, the Tarval Horse Guild declared a trade war. Officially, it was called something else, a recalculation of road tolls. The gist was simple. Any wagon passing through lands controlled by the guild pays a toll. Previously, the toll was calculated based on the number of horses. No horses, no toll. Now Tarval had introduced a new rule. The toll is calculated based on the weight of the cargo, and for horseless wagons, the rate is twice as high. Market Sr. sat in a chair with a broken leg and was cursing so loudly that the windows rattled. Maggie was calmer. She spread a map out on the table and showed Dan the alternative routes. 3 of the 5 roads between the capital and the major cities passed through Tarval's lands. 2 did not. Maggie suggested rerouting the trips to these 2 roads. They were a third longer but duty-free. Dan agreed.
Market Senior said it was a temporary solution,
That Tarval would keep pressing until he crushed them. Maggie said he wouldn't crush them if they grew faster than he could press. The second thing was better. Isara sent a messenger. The letter contained 2 words. Come tomorrow. Dan arrived. Isara received him in a small office. She wasn't alone. With her was an elderly man in uniform, General Arthur Kane, commander of what remained of the Valdemarian army. 3,000 soldiers, not a single horse. The general looked at Dan with an expression that could be described as skeptical curiosity. Isara explained. Intelligence reports indicated that the Holdgar Empire was massing troops at the border. Not right now, but war was possible within the next year. Holdgar wanted to swallow up Valdemar while it was still weak. Holdgar had cavalry, 12,000 horsemen. Valdemar had infantry without horses. Infantry without horses was a sitting duck. Unless. General Kane looked at Dan and said, unless someone gives my men the ability to move as fast as the cavalry, or faster. Dan was silent. Then he asked, you want military vehicles? Kane shook his head. He said, not vehicles. Logistics. His soldiers don't need iron horses. They need provisions, the wounded, and fortifications to be delivered faster than the enemy can organize. An army that eats on time and treats the wounded on time defeats an army that doesn't, even if that army has more horses. Dan looked at the general, a smart man, a rarity among military men. Kane continued. He said he needed 5 tractors by winter, ones capable of operating in mud and snow, on rough roads, carrying a load of 2,000 pounds each. Dan did the math in his head. 5 tractors in half a year. With current resources and manpower, 1 tractor takes 2 months. 5 would take 10 months. Not enough time. We need more people, more materials, more workshops. He said this out loud. Isara nodded. She said she'd provide everything. Dan looked at her. He asked, all of this, Your Majesty? The workshop? The funding? The military contract? You're putting everything you have on the line for me. Isara looked him in the eyes. She said, yes, because I have nothing else. Dan stood up. He bowed. Awkwardly because he didn't know how to bow and hadn't bowed to anyone in his past life. He said there would be 5 tractors by winter. He left the palace. He walked down the street back to the workshop, counting in his head. 5 tractors. Half a year. I need at least 10 new apprentices, a second smelter, a second foundry worker, a 6-month supply of copper, a steady supply of coal, and blueprints. Proper blueprints on paper, not on shale slabs. He stopped in the middle of the street. He thought. And he realized he needed Lillian. Not just as the archivist, as a draftswoman, as a documentarian, as someone who would record everything he did so that others could repeat it. Because if something happened to him, if Tarval got to him, or if the Order of the Silent Wheel, if it existed, decided it was time to repeat what had happened 300 years ago, knowledge must not die with him. Never again. He turned and walked toward the monastery. Lillian met him at the gate, as if she'd been waiting. He said, I need your help. She said, I know. He said, not as a nun, as an engineer. She looked at him, and for the first time ever, she smiled so widely that the freckles on her cheeks stretched. She said, I've been waiting 12 years to hear those words. The next 4 months were the hardest and happiest of both of Dan's lives. Hard because he worked until his body was on the verge of giving out. Happy because, for the first time, he wasn't working alone. The workshop had doubled in size. Father Marquette, who had finally gotten out of bed, found a second space across the street, a former stable. Maggie turned it into a warehouse and an office. On the wall hung a map of the routes for leggers studded with pins. Red routes for the tractor trailers. Blue for the planned ones. Green for the gas stations. Dan looked at this map and, for the first time, saw what had previously existed only in his head. A system. New apprentices arrived by the dozens. Isara had sent 20. Young men from families of craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, coppersmiths, and coopers. Dan divided them into 3 groups. The first group was with Horvik, the basics of metalworking. The second group was with Gareth, casting and soldering. The third group was with Dan, assembly and troubleshooting. Thomas became the senior apprentice, the de facto master. He could assemble a tractor from the frame to the finished machine without Dan's help. Slower, but correct. Lillian got her own room in the workshop, a table, a chair, shelves for notebooks, ink, and paper. Real paper. Isara had set some aside from the palace's supplies. Lillian sat at the table and drew. She transferred Dan's designs from his head onto paper. He explained. She drew. He made corrections. She redrew them. By the end of the first month, they had a folder with 20 drawings. A steam engine, a boiler, a transmission, a steering system, a braking system, a frame. Each drawing included dimensions and annotations, each one understandable to anyone who could read blueprints. Dan looked at that folder and thought, this is it. This is what the Brotherhood of the Iron Road didn't have. Or had but was destroyed. Documentation. Knowledge recorded so that anyone could replicate it. Not just one mind, but paper, which could be copied, to reproduce, to hide in 10 places, in 100. They wouldn't be able to burn all the copies. Never again. The first of the 5 military tractors was ready in 6 weeks, faster than Dan had expected, because now he wasn't building it himself. He was directing. He told them what to do and watched as they did it. He corrected them. He taught them. And he corrected them again. It was agonizing, because he saw every mistake, and his hands itched to do it himself. But he forced himself not to interfere, because if he did everything himself, he'd build 5 vehicles. If he taught people, they'd build 50. General Kane arrived for the test run of the first military tractor. He stood and watched as the vehicle pulled a cart loaded with 2,000 pounds of cargo along a muddy fall road. Mud flew from under the wheels. Steam billowed. The tractor roared and smoked and stank, but it kept moving. 3 miles an hour through the mud, twice as fast as an ox team. Kane walked over to Dan. He said, "This changes the war." Dan replied that it didn't change the war. It made war unnecessary. Kane looked at him with interest. He asked how. Dan explained. He said that an army capable of moving supplies and people faster than the enemy doesn't have to fight. It can outflank, retreat, stretch the enemy's supply lines, force the enemy to go where it doesn't want to go. Battle is the last resort. Logistics is the first. Kane listened. Then he said, "You're not a soldier, but you think like a general." Dan said he didn't think like a general, like a mechanic. War is a system, he said, like any machine. And like any machine, it can be taken apart to see where the bottleneck is. Kane nodded. From that day on, the general came to the workshop once a week. They sat over a map and discussed routes, supply points, and ways to quickly evacuate the wounded. Maggie listened to these conversations and made adjustments based on the cost and accessibility of the roads. Lillian drew up diagrams. Thomas built models out of wood. The workshop was turning into a command center. At the end of the second month, Ash arrived. It happened at night. Dan was working late, alone. The others were asleep. He was sitting at the workbench, sanding a valve seat for a new tractor. He heard a noise at the gate. He went out. A woman was standing at the gate. Tall, thin, blonde hair cut with a knife. Her travel clothes were dirty and torn. A knife on her belt. A bag in her hand. A tattoo on her wrist. A gear. She said, "You're Dan Hopper, the one who builds machines." Dan said yes. She said, "My name is Ashley Wenner. My father was Reed Wenner, an engineer. He tried to build machines 15 years ago. The horse guild killed him." She fell silent. Then she took a notebook out of the bag, a worn one with singed edges. She handed it to Dan. He opened it and saw the blueprints. Rough, naive, full of mistakes, but blueprints for a steam engine. Her father had tried, without knowledge, without materials, without support, all by himself, and he'd almost succeeded. Then the guild burned down his workshop, with him inside. Dan closed the notebook. He looked at Ash. She stood straight. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry and angry. She said, "I was a bandit for 10 years. I robbed merchants. I didn't kill anyone, but I robbed them, because that was the only thing I knew how to do. Then I heard about you, about your machines, and I came. Dan asked why. She said, because you're doing what my father tried to do, and I want to be a part of it, or kill those who killed him, or both. Dan looked at her. He saw anger. He saw pain. He saw something else behind them. He saw her hands, strong, deft, hands that knew how to use tools. He asked, do you know how to work with metal? She said, my father taught me since I was 6. Dan said, then come on in. You start tomorrow. She walked in, stopped in the middle of the workshop, looked around, at the tractors, at the tools, at the blueprints on the walls, and Dan saw her face change. The anger hadn't gone away, but something else appeared alongside it. Recognition. She was home. Ash turned out to be the best mechanic after Dan. She didn't know the theory. She didn't understand why things worked the way they did. But her hands were like those of a musician. She could feel the metal. She could feel when a bolt was tightened enough, when a gear was seated correctly, when a chain was tensioned just right. Dan taught her the theory. She taught him the practical techniques she'd picked up from her father. The techniques were rough but effective. A way to bend a copper tube without kinks. A way to harden small parts in oil mixed with sand. How to check a weld for leaks with soapy water. Things Dan knew but in a different way. And things he didn't know. After a week, Ash knew the workshop like the back of her hand. After 2 weeks, she was arguing with Maggie. After 3, with Lillian. After a month, with everyone. And everyone was arguing with her. She was rude, sassy. She didn't respect authority. She teased Dan in front of the apprentices. She said his blueprints were only good for wiping things down, that his trucks moved like 6 snails, that if her father had that many resources, he would have built 10 times as much. Dan listened. Sometimes he snapped back. Sometimes he stayed silent, because he could see that behind the rudeness lay fear. She was afraid. Afraid that if she stopped lashing out, the world would take everything away from her again. Just like it took her father. One evening, he found her alone in the workshop. She was sitting on the floor next to a tractor, holding her father's notebook. It was open to a page with a blueprint that was almost right. Almost, if Ash's father had known just a little more. If he'd been given time. If the guild hadn't come. Dan sat down next to her, silently. They sat like that for about 10 minutes. Then Ash said, without turning around, he was a good man. Better than me, Dan said. You're a good person too. Ash snorted. She said she was a former bandit. Dan said he was a former dead man, and that the past was the past. She looked at him, for the first time, without defiance, without a shield. She just looked. Then she stood up. She put away her notebook, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and said, all right, show me the blueprint for the new boiler. I saw a mistake in the flow calculation there. By winter, 5 military tractors were ready. All 5. On time. General Kane accepted them personally. He inspected each one. He test drove each one. He shook Dan's hand. He shook Thomas's hand. He shook Ash's hand. She had assembled the last tractor practically on her own. The tractors set off for the northern border. 5 vehicles. 5 drivers from among Dan's apprentices. 5 metric tons of cargo. On a road that not a single caravan could have traveled a month ago. Dan stood at the workshop gate and watched them leave. Standing nearby were Maggie, Lillian, Ash, Horwick, Grandma Ruth, Thomas, Gareth, and 20 apprentices. His people. His team. The trucks disappeared around the bend. The smoke dissipated into the winter air. Grandma Ruth said it was time for lunch. Everyone went inside. Dan stayed behind. He stood there, staring at the road, and he thought that somewhere in this town, or in this world, someone was also looking at this road and writing something down in a little notebook, and that someone wasn't happy. Winter came early and hit hard. Snow buried the roads 2 palms deep in a single night, then another 2. By the end of the first week of December, the roads between the capital and the southern cities had come to a standstill. The caravans ground to a halt. Trade stopped, and it immediately became clear who in the kingdom was moving and who wasn't. Dan's tractor trailers kept going, slower, with greater effort, but they kept moving. The wide wheels with iron spikes, which Ash had devised a week before the first snowfall, bit into the road and pulled. Two trucks on the southern route were hauling grain and firewood to villages that otherwise wouldn't have survived the winter. One truck on the eastern route was hauling medical supplies for the monastery hospital. Maggie coordinated the trips from the office. She hadn't slept for 3 days straight and yelled at the drivers through the dispatchers if they deviated from the schedule by even half an hour. Work in the workshop never stopped. Dan was building the 6th tractor trailer, a new design with a closed cab, double walls lined with felt, large wheels, and a reinforced frame. He called it the winter model. Thomas was building the 7th, and Ash the 8th, 3 vehicles at once. 20 apprentices worked in shifts. The furnaces never went out. Lillian drew without looking up. New blueprints. An improved boiler with an economizer. An economizer is a tube through which water flows before entering the boiler. The tube runs through the chimney and is heated by the exhaust gases. The water enters the boiler already hot. Less coal. More steam. Longer range. Dan explained the principle. Lillian drew up the blueprint. Gareth cast the tubes. Thomas assembled it. Ash tested it. The economizer yielded a 20% increase in efficiency. In practice, this meant that the tractor could travel 10 miles on a single fill of water rather than 8. And so, in the middle of winter, when everything seemed to be going well, when the trucks were running, the workshop was growing, and the Queen was smiling, Tarvel struck. Not with tariffs this time, with people. 3 truck drivers didn't show up for work one day. Dan sent Thomas to check it out. Thomas returned with the news. The drivers had been intimidated. That night, masked men came to each of them. They said that if they got behind the wheel one more time, their families would suffer. Their children, their wives, parents. The drivers weren't cowards, but they were people with families. Dan sat in the workshop feeling anger. Cold, heavy, like a lump of cast iron in his chest. Ash stood beside him. She was silent. Then she said quietly, "That's how they killed my father. First, they intimidated the people around him. Then they came for him when he was alone." Dan looked at her. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and went to the palace. Isara received him immediately. She listened. Her face grew stern. She called a guard. She gave an order. By evening, the drivers' families had been moved to houses near the workshop, under the protection of the royal guard. The drivers returned the next morning. Isara came to the workshop in person. She stood before everyone, and she said, "Everyone who works here is under my protection. Your families are under my protection. If anyone threatens you, come to me. Not to the guards. Not to the lords, to me." She spoke quietly, but so that every word could be heard, and every word was like a stone. Dan stood nearby and looked at her, 22 years old, a thin, red-haired girl with freckles who was carrying an entire kingdom on her shoulders. And she doesn't buckle. He thought that if all kings were like her, the world would be a different place. Tarvel replied a week later. This time in the council, he demanded an investigation into the workshop's operations. He declared that steam engines were dangerous, that boilers could explode, that the smoke poisoned the air, that the noise frightened the livestock, that the roads were being ruined by heavy wheels. He brought witnesses. A farmer whose cow had allegedly stopped giving milk after a tractor drove by. A priest who claimed that the machines were an abomination to the gods. A doctor who claimed that steam fumes cause fever. Dan sat in the council and listened. Maggie sat next to him, clenching her teeth so hard her jawbones turned white. When Tarvel finished, Isara gave Dan the floor. He stood up. He looked at the council. 12 lords. Half were sympathetic, half were not. Tarvel looked at him with a faint smile. Dan did not argue with the accusations. Instead, he said one thing. He said that over the past 3 months, the tractors had delivered 14,000 pounds of grain and salt to the mountain villages. That as for the machines, these villages had received nothing. That 7 children had been taken to doctors and had survived. That without the tractors, they would not have survived. Then he said, "I'm ready to stop all the vehicles right now. If the council decides that 7 children's lives are worth less than the peace of mind of a single cow." The council was silent. Tarvel was silent. Isara was silent. But there was a hint of a smile on her face. The council voted. 10 in favor of continuing the work. 2 against. Tarvel walked out of the hall without looking back. Maggie said he was more dangerous now than before, that a cornered beast bites harder. Dan knew that, but he had no intention of stopping. At the end of winter, what Dan had been thinking about since his first month in the workshop finally happened. He was standing in the stone room that Isara had given him as his private office. Blueprints lay on the table, and Father Ash's notebook,
And Lillian's notebooks with copies of the ancient drawings.
and that very drawing, in Latin script, with notes in English. He laid out all three sources side by side. The ancient drawings were 300 years old. Reed Wenner's drawings were 15 years old. His own drawings. And then he saw it. A line. Uneven, broken, but a line. Someone 300 years ago knew what he knew. Someone 15 years ago tried to replicate it, and both were destroyed. Not by war, not by the plague, not by ignorance. Deliberate destruction. Organized, well-planned, effective. The order of the silent wheel. Dan sat down. He closed his eyes. And for the first time, he truly afraid. Not for himself, for Lillian's notebooks, for the tractor trailers, for the students, for everything he had built. Because 300 years ago, they had built things too, and nothing remained. Spring began with the road. Dan decided it was time to build not machines, but the path along which they would travel. He called it Route 1, a short of a paved road from the capital to the city of Crossmore, 20 miles. On the usual dirt road, a tractor trailer took 6 hours to cover this distance. On a good road, Dan expected to cut that down to 3. He came up with the pavement using whatever was available, crushed stone from the rubble of old walls. The capital was full of ruins, abandoned houses, destroyed barracks, collapsed walls. Stone lay unused. Dan offered Isara a simple deal. He would clear away the rubble, making room in the city. The stone would go toward the road. Isara agreed immediately. Maggie organized the workers, 40 people, former unemployed residents from the city slums. The pay was modest but included meals. A line formed outside the workshop gates. Horvick supervised the stone crushing. The old man turned out to be the perfect foreman, patient. He could identify every type of stone by touch. Limestone for the bottom layer, granite for the top, sand between the layers for drainage. Dan explained the principles of road construction to him. 3 layers. Large stones at the bottom for the foundation, medium-sized stones in the middle for density, fine gravel on top for evenness. Tamp it down. Sprinkle with water. Compact again. For compaction, he built a steamroller, a heavy cast-iron cylinder on an axle hitched to a tractor. The tractor pulled the roller along the road, and the roller pressed the gravel into a dense, level surface. The first mile took 2 weeks. The second, 10 days. The third, a week. The workers were learning. The process picked up speed. By the end of the second month, 10 miles were ready, and then Dan did what he'd been thinking about for a long time. He launched the first regular route, a steam omnibus. Not a freight truck, but a passenger one. A long platform mounted on a truck chassis, with wooden benches and a canopy to shelter from the rain. 12 seats. The route ran from the capital to Crossmore, once a day in the morning, back in the evening. The fare was 1 copper coin. That's what a jug of milk cost. The first trip took place at the start of summer. Thomas was behind the wheel. Dan stood in the square and watched as 12 people boarded the omnibus. Merchants, farmers, a monk, 2 women with baskets, a boy of about 10 who was clutching a live piglet to his chest. Thomas let off steam. The omnibus set off. The square watched it go. Dan watched it go too, and he felt it. There it was. This wasn't a demonstration for the lords, not a military order for a general. These were ordinary people going about their ordinary business, by car, for the first time. The trip to Crossmore took 3 hours and 20 minutes. The return trip took just as long. 12 passengers in the morning, 15 in the evening. On the second day, 20 in the morning. On the third day, people were standing in line. Maggie counted them. Profit for the first week. Small, but positive. She looked at Dan and, for the first time ever, smiled at him without a trace of irritation. She said he turned out not to be entirely hopeless. Dan said thank you. She said it wasn't a compliment but a statement of fact. Alongside the tract and the omnibus, Dan was working on a project for Lillian, a steam-powered printing press. Every day, Lillian copied the blueprints by hand, pen, and ink. One copy of a single blueprint took 2 hours. 20 blueprints, 3 copies each, came to 120 hours, a month of non-stop work, just to have spare copies. That was unacceptable. Dan knew how a printing press worked. Gutenberg. Movable type. But he didn't need movable type. He needed an engraving press. The drawing is engraved in mirror image onto a copper plate. The plate is coated with ink. It's pressed against the paper. A print. An exact copy. 100 of them. 1,000. Gareth engraved the plates. Lillian transferred the drawings onto the copper with a special engraving tool. Dan assembled the frame of the press with a steam-powered press mechanism. A large lever pressed the plate against the paper with a force that no single person could generate by hand. The first print came out at the end of summer. Lillian held a sheet of paper with a drawing of a steam cylinder. An exact copy. Every very line. Every number. Every mark. She looked at the sheet, and her hands trembled. Then she turned to Dan. Her eyes were wet. She said, "Now they won't be able to destroy it. We'll print 1,000 copies and send them to every monastery, every library, and every blacksmith shop in the kingdom. They won't burn them all. Never." Then she stepped toward him. She stood on tiptoe because she was a head shorter than him, and she kissed him on the cheek. Quickly, gently, and she ran off. Red as a copper sheet after being heated. Dan stood there, holding his cheek. Horvik stepped out from behind the machine. He looked at him. He grumbled. "Don't just stand there like a statue. There's plenty of work to do." A week after the press was up and running, Dan printed the first batch of blueprints. 50 sets. Each set had 20 sheets. 1,000 sheets. Lillian personally delivered 10 sets to the monasteries. Maggie sent 10 with caravans to the cities. 5 were sent to the border on military trucks. Dan handed the rest out to his students. 1 set for each of them. He said, "These aren't my blueprints. They're yours. Study from them. Copy them. Pass them on. If anything happens to me, you'll carry on." Thomas asked why he was saying that. What could possibly happen to him? Dan didn't answer, but he looked at Ash, and she looked back at him, and they both knew. Because Tarvel had been silent for 2 months now, and the silence was more frightening than any threats. The blow came from where Dan least expected it, not from Tarvel, from the Empire. One morning, Isara sent a messenger for him, urgent. Dan arrived at the palace and saw General Kane. The general's face was ashen. Intelligence had reported it. The Empire of Holdgar had mobilized its troops, not for winter as expected. Now. 20,000 soldiers, 12,000 cavalry. Artillery pulled by oxen. Direction of the attack, through the northern pass, straight toward the capital. 3 weeks until they arrive. Isara sat at the table, calm. Too calm. Her hands were folded. Her nails were bitten down to the quick. Kane unfolded a map. He pointed. "Here is the border. Here is the pass. Here's the road to the capital. We have 3,000 soldiers. They have 20,000. A head-on battle is impossible. There's nowhere to retreat. Surrendering the city means the end of the kingdom." Dan looked at the map. Then he sat down. He closed his eyes and began to think. Not as a soldier, as a mechanic. The system. Where's the bottleneck? 20,000 soldiers means 20,000 mouths to feed. 12,000 horses means another 12,000 mouths, plus the oxen for the artillery. An army of that size eats like a city, every day. Supplies come in via a single road, through the pass. A bottleneck. He opened his eyes, looked at Kane, and said, "We won't stop them. We'll outpace them." Kane raised an eyebrow. Dan explained, "The Imperial Army is moving at the speed of a marching column, 15 miles a day at most. The cavalry is faster, but it won't stray far from the supply train, because without the supply train, the horses won't eat. Our trucks cover 30 miles a day on a good road, 20 on a bad one. We can't defeat them in battle, but we can get everywhere before they do." The plan was this. First, evacuation. All villages in the Imperial Army's path, people, livestock, grain, are loaded onto trucks and transported south. The empire marches into a barren land. No food, no fodder, no water in the wells. Second, mobile defense. The trucks carry fortifications, collapsible wooden walls with sandbags. They're set up in 2 hours. They're dismantled in an hour. The Imperial Army approaches the position. It sees the fortification. It prepares to attack. It wastes half a day. But the fortification is already gone. It's moved 5 miles further on, and it's set up again. Third, supplies. While the Empire starves, our army eats. Every day. Hot meals. From field kitchens on steam stoves, which are also transported by tractor trailers. A well-fed soldier fights better than a hungry one. This isn't tactics, it's arithmetic. Cain listened. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "This is madness." Then he paused again and said, "This might work." Isara stood up. She walked over to the map. She looked at it, then at Dan. She said, "Go ahead." The next 3 weeks were hell. Real hell. No qualms about it. Dan worked 20 hours a day. He slept 4. Sometimes 2. All the tractor trailers were mobilized. All 8 of them. Plus 2 new ones that Thomas and Ash had managed to assemble in a week by depriving themselves and 10 students of sleep. 10 vehicles. Maggie coordinated the evacuation. She rode on a donkey because the war hadn't taken the donkeys yet. She went from village to village. She explained. She persuaded. She yelled at those who didn't leave. She cried with those who couldn't. 14 villages in the path of the Imperial Army. 300 families. 1,500 people. The trucks ran around the clock. Day and night. The drivers took turns on the road. Dan took the wheel himself on the 3rd day when one of the drivers collapsed from exhaustion. He drove for 12 hours. He was transporting a family with 4 children and an old woman who refused to leave her goat behind. The goat rode in the cab. Dan drove the truck with one hand while holding the goat by the horns with the other. Ash was driving the truck next to him. She was transporting prefabricated fortifications to the northern front line. Logs, bags of dirt, and ropes. 3 metric tons. The tractor roared on the uphill stretches. Sparks flew from the exhaust pipe. Ash drove it as if she'd been born behind the controls. Horvick stayed in the workshop. He repaired the tractor trailers that came in broken, one after another. Broken chains, cracked frames, burned out grates. The old man worked non-stop. Grandma Ruth stood nearby, handing him tools. She was 67 years old, and she handed him a 5-kilogram hammer as easily as a spoon. Lillian worked at headquarters with Cain. She drew up movement maps. She calculated distances and times. Her math turned out to be flawless. Cain looked at her calculations and said that he didn't have a single officer at headquarters who could calculate faster than this nun. Heron showed up at the most difficult moment. Dan didn't even have time to be surprised. A small, thin girl with short-cropped black hair and a scar across her eyebrow came to the workshop on the 10th day of mobilization. She said she'd heard about the machines, that she was an alchemist, that she knew how to make oil and lubricants, that she had nowhere else to go. Dan looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes. Her hands were trembling. She had the look of a hunted animal. And he said, "Come in. The oil workshop is in the right-hand corner. The tools are on the shelf. If you need something that's not there, tell Maggie. She'll find it." Hareen went in. She looked around, and she started working. 2 days later, the tractors had oil that didn't freeze in the cold or burn when heated. She made it from flaxseed and animal fat with additives known only to her. Dan tested the oil with his fingers. Smooth, durable, perfect for bearings. He looked at Hareen. He asked where she'd learned this. She said her teacher had been the best alchemist in the Eastern Kingdom, and that he'd been executed for dangerous experiments. She'd fled 3 years ago. She'd been traveling west ever since. Dan nodded. He said no one here would lay a finger on her. Hareen looked at him. She didn't believe him, but she stayed. The Imperial Army entered Weldmar on the 21st day, right on schedule. 20,000 soldiers, cavalry, artillery, banners, drums, generals in golden armor, and barren land. Not a single village with supplies, not a single well with water. The wells had been filled in, the bridges dismantled, the roads dug up. The Imperial army marched forward and found nothing around every bend. After 3 days, problems with fodder began. After 5 days, the horses began to weaken. After a week, the Imperial generals realized that the supply train coming over the pass would not arrive in time, because the road through the pass had also been dug up, and repairing it under fire from Veldmar archers entrenched on the slopes proved impossible. At the same time, mobile defenses were in action. Tractors hauled fortifications. They set them up. The Imperial cavalry galloped toward a position. They turned around. But the position was already gone. It was 5 miles further on. And there it stood again. The Imperial generals were going mad. They couldn't understand how the enemy was moving faster than the cavalry. They didn't know about the tractors. Intelligence reported seeing smoking machines, but the generals didn't believe it. They considered it a fabrication by cowardly spies. On the 12th day of the invasion, the Imperial army came to a halt. Horses were collapsing. Soldiers were starving. The artillery was stuck in the mud because the oxen couldn't pull it without fodder. Imperial General Holt sent a messenger to Isara with a proposal for a truce. Isara received the messenger in the field, riding a draft horse, on purpose, so the messenger would see, and report it. General Holt received the terms: complete withdrawal of troops, recognition of Veldmar's borders, and a trade agreement on Veldmar's terms. Holt accepted. He had no choice. An army that cannot eat cannot fight. The night after the truce, the Veldmar army camp on the northern highway. Campfires, soldiers sleeping. The tractors lined up in a row, cooling down. 10 vehicles that had won the war without a single battle. Dan wasn't sleeping. He sat by the campfire, repairing the steam valve on the 6th tractor, which had been sticking for the past 3 days. His hands moved of their own accord. His mind was blank. He was so tired that his exhaustion had turned into some new state, neither alertness nor sleep, something in between. Isara was sitting nearby. She hadn't slept either. She sat in a simple travel coat with a mug of tea. She was silent. She was staring at the fire. Then she spoke. "You know that Tarvel fled?" Dan looked up. "No, I didn't know." Isara explained. When it became clear that the Empire was retreating, Tarvel disappeared from the capital. 4 advisors and the treasurer of the Equestrian Guild disappeared with him, and the documents from Tarvel's personal archive. Everything. Kane sent men to his estate. The estate was empty. The stables were empty. The safes had been broken into. But Kane's guards found something in a secret room behind the wall of his study. Papers. Isara pulled a bundle from under her cloak. She unwrapped it. Dan took the papers. He read them by the light of the campfire. It was correspondence between Tarvel and someone who signed only with a symbol, a circle with 8 spokes, like a wheel. The letters were old. The earliest was 20 years old. They discussed engineer Reed Wenner, Father Ash, his attempts to build machines, and the need to eliminate him. Dan read and felt a chill rise from his stomach to his throat. Letter after letter. Reed Wenner was too close to discovering the steam engine. Reed Wenner had found the wreckage of an ancient machine in the ruins to the north. Reed Wenner was dangerous. Reed Wenner has been eliminated. The workshop has been burned down. The materials have been destroyed. The last letter from Tarvel, dated 6 months ago. In it, Tarvel wrote about Dan, about his machines, about the threat, and he asked for instructions. The reply was brief. 4 words. Just like 300 years ago. Dan set the papers aside. He looked at Isara. She was looking at him. She said, "The Order of the Silent Wheel. It's real. Tarvel was one of them. 20 years, maybe longer. My regent, my advisor. The man who rocked me on his lap when I was a child." Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenching the mug so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Dan remained silent. Then he asked, "They'll come again." Isara nodded. She said that Tarvel hadn't fled alone, that the Order wasn't just one person or even 10. It was a network, embedded in every kingdom, in every guild, in every court. For 300 years, they've kept the world frozen in place. And they won't stop just because one mechanic built 10 machines. Dan stared into the fire. He thought. Then he said, "They stopped the Brotherhood of the Iron Road because the knowledge was in people's heads. Kill the people, and the knowledge dies. They stopped Reed Venner because he was alone. Kill one, and it's all over. But we can't be stopped that way, because the knowledge isn't in people's heads anymore. It's on paper, in 1,000 copies, in 100 workshops, in 20 students, each of whom can teach 20 more. To stop this, you'd have to burn the entire kingdom. And that's not even an order anymore. That's a war, and we've just won one. Isara listened. Then she said quietly, "Do you really believe it's impossible to stop this?" Dan shook his head. He said he didn't believe it. That he knew. Because in his world, it had already happened. The Industrial Revolution. They tried to stop it. They smashed machines. They killed inventors. They passed laws. It didn't help. Because when knowledge becomes shared, when any blacksmith in any village can open a notebook and build a steam engine, then, to stop it, you'd have to kill all the blacksmiths. And without blacksmiths, the world cannot exist. He fell silent. Isara looked at him. Then she said, "You just told me about your world for the first time." Dan froze. She was right. He nodded. She said, "Tell me more." "Someday." "Someday," he said. "Someday." She handed him a mug of tea. He took a sip. Hot. Sweet. With some kind of local honey. They sat by the fire and drank tea. Two people separated by worlds and centuries, yet united by iron and steam and a simple, stubborn desire for tomorrow to be better than yesterday. The next morning, the army set off back toward the capital. The tractor trailers were carrying the wounded. Not many. There had been almost no fighting. But there were those suffering from frostbite, those who had fallen ill, and those who had broken their legs on the washed-out roads. Dan was riding in the lead tractor trailer. Isara was beside him. She had refused the carriage. She said she would travel with the army, in a truck. Maggie rode in the second truck with reports and figures. She was already calculating the cost of repairing the destroyed roads and filling in the buried wells. Lillian rode in the third, with a printing press. She was printing leaflets right on the road. A report on the war. About how the trucks saved the kingdom. About how machines are neither evil nor magic, but tools. For people. Ash brought up the rear, the last truck, the most battered one, with a patched-up frame and a bandaged engine block. She wouldn't let anyone else drive it. She said that a machine that had been through the war deserved a driver who had been through the war too. Heron was riding with Lillian. Quiet, small, with a bag of new recipes for oils and lubricants that she'd developed in the field. She hardly spoke. But one evening during a rest stop, she approached Dan and said, "Thank you for not kicking me out." Dan said, "You're welcome." She shook her head. She said, "My teacher used to say that knowledge should be free. He was killed for it. You're doing the same thing. You print the blueprints. You give them out for free. Aren't you afraid?" Dan said he was afraid. Every day. But he kept doing it. Because the alternative was worse. Heron nodded. Then she left. But from that day on, she smiled more often. As they approached the capital, a crowd greeted them. Thousands of people. Shouts. Flowers. Children on their fathers' shoulders. For the first time in 3 years, Valdemar was celebrating. Not a victory in battle. A victory over distance. Over hunger. Over fear. The tractor trailers drove through the main gates and pulled up in the square. 10 trucks. Dirty. Battered. With patches and ropes and traces of soot. And beautiful. Dan climbed down from the lead tractor. His legs buckled, and he nearly fell. Horvik caught him. The old man stood by the workshop gate, waiting. Grandma Ruth stood nearby with a pot of stew, a huge pot, enough for the whole crew. Dan hugged Horvik, tightly. The old man hugged him back. He didn't say a word, because words weren't needed. Grandma Ruth shoved a bowl into his hands. She told him to eat. Dan ate, standing up, in the workshop yard, surrounded by the people who had become his family. And for the first time in 2 years in this world, he didn't think about what he needed to build next. A year had passed. Dan stood on a hill outside the city and looked down. The road from the capital stretched southward. Route 1. 20 miles of smooth stone. Now Route 2 ran eastward, and Route 3 headed north toward the pass. 3 roads. 3 directions. 3 arteries through which the blood of the new Weldmar flowed. The morning omnibus was traveling along Route 1. Dan saw the white plume of steam rising above the rooftops. 15 passengers. Every day. 2 trips, morning and evening. People had gotten used to it. An old woman from Crossmoor traveled to the capital to visit her daughter once a week. A farmer from Stonebridge took his milk to market and returned by lunchtime. A boy from the village beyond the pass traveled to the capital to attend school. Every day, back and forth, by car. The Shesterny School opened 3 months ago. A former coach house, now a training workshop. 40 students, half from the Queen's estate, a quarter from the monasteries. A quarter came on their own. Thomas taught assembly. Ash taught repairs. Gareth taught casting. Lillian taught drafting and calculations. Heron taught the chemistry of oils and lubricants. Dan gave 1 lecture a week. On systems. Not on cars. On systems. He explains that a vehicle without a road is a toy. That a road without a gas station is a dead end. That a gas station without a mechanic is a trap. That everything is connected. And that a true engineer sees not the parts, but the connections between them. The students listened. Some understood. Some didn't. But they all learned. And after 6 months, each of them could build a tractor from scratch. Marquette Sr. had been walking on his own 2 feet for a long time. His leg had healed crookedly, and he limped. But his mind worked better than ever. He founded the Steam Trading Company, the world's first transportation company without a single horse. 12 tractors, 6 routes, 4 warehouses, 20 drivers. Maggie was the manager. She'd been the de facto manager from day one. Now it was official. Marquette Sr. sat in an armchair by the fireplace and received reports. Dan stopped by to see him once a week. The old merchant asked the same question every time. When will the steamboat be ready? Dan gave the same answer every time. Soon. The barge was almost ready. The first steamboat on the Line River, a flat-bottomed barge, with a paddle wheel, with a cargo hold capable of carrying 5 metric tons. It was being built at a shipyard outside town. 8 craftsmen, 2 months of work. Dan designed it. Lillian drew the plans. Gareth cast the engine. Thomas assembled the transmission. Ash installed the steam system. Heron welded the water-resistant grease for the propeller shaft. Horvick sat by the barges and grumbled that water wasn't his business and that iron belonged on dry land. But that evening, he quietly told Dan that the barge was beautiful. For Horvick, that was the highest compliment. The barge was launched in early fall. It didn't sink. That was the first success. Then Dan started the engine. The paddle wheel turned. The water churned. And the barge began to move against the current. Slower than a horse-drawn cart, but it was carrying 5 metric tons. Not a single horse. Not a single team of oxen. 5 metric tons on the water, powered by steam. From the capital to the southern ports down the river. 9 days instead of 2 months. Dan stood on the deck and watched the banks drift by. Maggie stood beside him. She was counting in her head. Then she said, "We just put an end to horse-drawn transport on the entire river." If Tarvel had seen this, he'd have hanged himself. Dan didn't answer. Tarvel wouldn't have hanged himself. Tarvel was somewhere else, with the order. And Dan knew they'd return. But not now. Right now, the barge was sailing down the river, the sun was glinting off the water, and Maggie was standing beside him, the wind ruffling her dark hair that had come loose from her braid. Dan looked at the river, then at her. She caught his gaze, raised an eyebrow, said, "What?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "You're lying." He said, "I'm lying." She snorted, but the corner of her mouth twitched. A week after the barge was launched, Dan did what he'd promised himself he'd do a long time ago. He built a stove for Grandma Ruth. Not just any stove, a steam stove, with adjustable temperature, with an oven, with a water heater, with a copper griddle, with a chimney that vented the smoke outside while keeping the heat inside. Grandma Ruth stood in front of the stove and said nothing, for a long time. Then she placed one hand on the warm copper griddle, then the other. She stood there for a minute. Then she turned to Dan. Her eyes were wet. She said, "Son." That word struck Dan right in the chest. She had never called him that before. Son. She and Horvick had no children, 67 years, an empty house, an empty smithy that would have gone to strangers after they were gone. And now, here it was. The stove. And the young man who had built it, and a workshop full of people, and a house full of sounds. Dan hugged her. She was small and thin and smelled of flour and smoke and home. She hugged him back and held him tight. Horvik stood in the doorway, watching, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Then he grumbled, "It's a good stove. But you put the pipe in crooked," Dan laughed. That evening, he was sitting in the basement of the Royal Archives. Isara had granted him access a month ago. He'd been coming here every week, searching, leafing through old records, parchments 300 years old. And that evening, he found it. A bundle in the far corner behind a wall of crates, leather-bound, cracked with age. Inside was a drawing, large, detailed, a double-acting steam engine with a flywheel and a speed regulator. A design that hadn't appeared in his world until the early 19th century. And here it had been drawn 300 years ago. And in the corner of the blueprint, in small handwriting, in the Latin alphabet, was a note. Dan read it, and the world stood still. The note read, "If you're reading this, it means you've ended up here too. So the bridge works both ways." So the world was calling again. Don't give up. They'll try to stop you just as they stopped me, but you'll be smarter. Don't keep this knowledge to yourself. Share it with people, everyone, every single person. They won't be able to kill everyone. Signed, D. Hopper. Dan stared at the drawing, at the signature, at his own handwriting. 300 years ago. He was here, himself, or another version of him. Or perhaps the same bridge across the same river through the same darkness had sent him here twice. 300 years apart, and the first time he lost. The order stopped him, destroyed everything he had built. But not everything. The blueprints survived. In the monastery, in the notebooks that Lillian had been copying since she was 12. And he returned. 300 years later, through death, across a bridge of water and darkness. He returned and did what he couldn't do the first time. He gave the knowledge to the people, to everyone. He sat in the basement, holding the blueprint in his hands, tears streaming down his face. Not from grief, from understanding. He wasn't an outsider. He was the answer, the one the world had given itself. After 300 years and 2 lifetimes, he rolled up the blueprint, hid it in his shirt front, left the basement, climbed the stairs. He stepped out onto the street. Night, the capital, streetlights, the distant whistle of a steam locomotive on its night run, 2 moons above the rooftops. He walked toward the workshop. The first new model omnibus stood in the square. Fresh paint, copper handrails, a roof to keep out the rain, leather upholstered seats. Tomorrow it would carry its first passengers along Route 3, all the way to the sea. Dan reached the workshop. He sat down on the steps, dirty, tired, with his arm bandaged, with a 300-year-old blueprint tucked under his arm. Laughter drifted out of the workshop. Maggie was arguing with Ash about the flight schedule. Lillian was explaining the pressure regulator to Heron. Grandma Ruth was clanging away at her new stove. Horvik was tapping away with a hammer. Thomas was singing, off-key. Gareth was telling him to shut up. The door opened. Isara stepped out onto the steps, without her crown, in a simple cloak, carrying 2 mugs of hot cider. She sat down next to him. She held out a mug. Dan took it. They sat in silence. 2 moons were rising over the city. One was yellow, the other was blue. Isara said quietly, "Daniel, I don't know who you really are or where you're from, but if you ever decide to go back to where you came from, I'll understand. Just know this, all of us, because of you, we're alive for the first time." Dan nodded silently. He took a sip of cider. He looked at his hands, black with fuel oil, with traces of burns and calluses and ingrained grease. The hands of a craftsman, in both lives. He looked at Isara, at her freckles, at her tired eyes, at her bitten nails stained with ink. And he said, "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, for a long time. Then she rested her head on his shoulder, gently, as if by accident. But she didn't move it away. They sat on the steps of the workshop. 2 people, a queen and a mechanic. A girl who holds a country on her shoulders, and a man with a wrench who simply builds. Behind them, lights were on and life was bustling. Before them lay the city. Beyond the city, roads. Beyond the roads, the world, which was finally moving. Somewhere far away in the darkness at the edge of the square, A man in a gray raincoat stood and looked at the workshop, at the light in the windows, at the steam rising from the chimney, at the two people on the steps. He took out a small notebook, jotted something down, then put the notebook away, stood there for another minute, and left, disappeared into the night. But Dan wasn't thinking about him. Not now. Right now, the cider was hot. Isara's shoulder was warm. The workshop smelled of oil and iron and Grandma Ruth's pie. And 2 moons hung over a world that no longer stands still. In the morning he'll get up, he'll grab his tools, and he'll go build, because that's what he knows how to do. What he did in his past life, and the one before that, and what he'll do in this one. Build, repair, move forward. For them, for everyone.